right here. We are capturing chat so that we can look at that later. And as I think I've shared in updates in the board meetings and things like that, what we're doing is taking all of the input we get from these meetings, all the input that comes into the email cannabis.ordinance@trinitycounty.org, and any other things that are coming to us individually because we send it to that email address. And all of those staff is going through the effort of trying to put those into the sections or kind of in sections to match the ordinance document so that at some point, is it the 11th that we scheduled an all-day meeting, 11th, 12th, something like that?
Yeah, next Wednesday.
Next Wednesday, we have scheduled for the ad hoc an all-day meeting where we will go back through the document and back through all of the comments by section that we have received. And we'll be working on that next draft, which is what will end up going to the Planning Commission. So this input is critical. It's not more important than the input we get via the other channels. It's just, this is an opportunity to engage instead of sending a one-way communication. So we love having this opportunity. I do want to set the stage. No doubt for any subject that you bring to a session like this, a public workshop, there's going to be diverse opinions. What we really want to encourage is, just as you want your opinion and your opportunity to speak to be respected, that should be the same for everyone here. So if somebody's saying something you don't agree with, that's fine, but hold on to your feelings about it. If we ask for a counter opinions, you're really welcome to offer that, but we'll not interrupt each other and will not challenge in the moment, if you will. I will be capturing information over here that will go up around the room. And then again, all those notes, and the staff are taking notes as well, are going to be in that kind of working document that we're going to use to try to keep moving this thing forward. Trent is not here, our CAO. He had to be at a board meeting. He's got 2 board meetings, I think last night and tonight, that are on the coast for the insurance organizations that we work with. So he just couldn't be here. But Bella, pardon me, oh, he is on Zoom. Well, I can't really talk about him. That's not good. But we do have several members of the staff here to answer questions and again, to take your information. And then fellow supervisor Dan Frazier is here. He and I are the board representatives to the Cannabis Ordinance Update Ad Hoc. We're going to start with Drew is going to take us through a couple of updates just to kind of set the stage for, well, what are we doing? Why are we doing it? What's the context of which we're coming together? And then what we're going to do is, as we have in the other meetings, is find out from the group, what are the areas that you want to discuss and kind of get a sense of priority of that. And then we'll kind of start digging in. And we, I had a question about, well, gee, will we be able to move on to fresh stuff because some of us have gone through the old? And I said, well, there's some people who haven't been here before. They might want to still go over things that we've already gone over. So we'll just see where we are with the group that's here and we'll take it from there. Drew, you want to take over?
Sure. Good evening, everyone. We're going to run through these first couple slides for you. So this is just the cover slide. We'll go to the next one, which is the workshop agenda, just to kind of give you a brief. So Rick already took care of the introductions. Okay, these slides are a little different than what I'm looking at, but it's the old PowerPoint. All right, give us 1 second or 2 minutes. Thank you.
So what we can wait while we're doing that, if you guys can all just introduce yourselves so that folks know who's here.
All right, I guess I'll start. My name is Drew Plabani. I'm the Cannabis Division Director for Community Development Department.
I'm Bella Hedke, Associate Planner for the Cannabis Division in the Community Development Department.
And then, oh, you guys can introduce yourselves.
And I'm the admin, working on admin stuff. The debt.
You need help?
I
Pull the one from the website.
Any other questions?
Okay. You have-
We are having another meeting.
The other PowerPoint, we just have to jump around.
Yeah, another meeting in Hayfork tomorrow. And did we confirm location?
It's going to be at the Fairgrounds Dining Hall, same location
The
as
same
last meeting.
location.
Yep.
Okay, I know we talked about moving it to the exhibit hall or something for better internet, but we think we're just going to stick with what we had. Okay, so in the dining hall of the Fairgrounds, same time tomorrow night. And we will have Zoom and the same way that we produced the last one. And we will post the recordings of tonight and that night on the site. Yes.
My neighborhood has had opt-outs.
We'll take that in here. I mean, more questions about the process. Sorry for right now. But you're asking about specifically how opt-outs will be handled with the ordinance change?
Yeah, I mean, I've been out of the loop for
Okay.
a while, and so I just wondered in the process, how does what are opt-outs?
Okay, so we will talk about that. I have no doubt. Okay, any other process questions? And my apologies for not being clear. We definitely want to dig into that. Yes, Veronica. The question is, will we be scheduling any more meetings? We're going to be talking about that tomorrow. We have our regular ad hoc meeting, which is only a couple hours long. And we'll be kind of going over what we've heard so far, including input about more meetings and such. And then we'll make that determination. Yeah, we have talked about having more meetings. We've talked about how that impacts timeline. We've had issues come up in the board meeting this week where we are now calling on the Planning Commission for more engagement in the general plan than they had anticipated. So their schedule is going to get busier. And so we have to make sure that we're being respectful of that. So we've got to take all that into consideration and figure out how we move forward. Yes, sir.
Like I kind of mentioned to you earlier, I'm hoping that the first two meetings, we basically covered the same 2 to 3 topics in depth. Both meetings didn't make it any farther to any of the other issues. Both of those meetings are posted online, so anybody can access them. And I doubt there's a lot of new information that's going to come out. I'm really hoping that we can, if we follow the same process, I feel like we're just going to tread the same ground, and I'm really hoping we can progress to the half dozen other issues that we can already make it to that are available online free for anybody to watch.
So for everybody listening in too, the feedback is, I mentioned it briefly, but a desire that, or a preference that we would move to new things that haven't been discussed in the last 2 meetings that have already been recorded and posted online that everybody can see. And I hear you and I understand where you're coming from. I think we've pretty much, as an ad hoc committee, committed to sticking with the same process. And in part, that's in recognition of different people can make it different nights. And this is an opportunity to engage. So we want to give the audience, the participants who are here, that opportunity to decide what we're going to focus on first. So hopefully we'll get to some new stuff. And I will, to the extent that I can pull it out of my memory banks, if we start to talk about things that we've already talked about in that idea or that issue or that something has been raised, we can kind of acknowledge that we have that information, but I don't want to cut people off from, as we'll talk about when we get started, we're really here, we want to hear ideas, questions, concerns about the ordinance update so that we can capture all of that. And we do, for those of you who are new, we sometimes will kind of, if we get a sense of something, we'll say, well, how many people support that, how many people don't, and then maybe even dig in a little bit about why, so that we have this better understanding. Because again, the whole point is the folks that are going to be working on this next draft, we want to make sure that we are understanding the input that is coming to us. So I understand, I'm with you, I want to get to new stuff, but I want to respect that we have some new folks. Yes, you're going to kill me having M&Ms in the front.
They're not Skittles.
Oh,
That
Skittles.
was my alarm went off that said I get a Skittle.
Oh, okay.
So what I'm hearing is if anybody doesn't hear in any of these in-person meetings, the subject matter they'd like to cover with the committee or staff, they should email to that cannabis.ordinance at
TAA.
at trinitycounty.org, so that that conversation can still be happening,
Mhm.
but in a written format, email format, or some format that someone can be heard.
Yes, and again, for everyone, like we started out, we do see these as very important mechanisms for us to engage. The email address, cannabis.ordinance@trinitycounty.org. That is now a shared mailbox, so that goes in and all the staff members who are working on this get that. And then someone there is forwarding to Dan and I as appropriate, but also whether it's to that email address, any other email address that you ask to go to the board about this subject is getting sent to that same email address. So it's all coming together and it's all getting collected. And we will have all of those comments captured here via email, any other kind of things like that will be reflected in the document that we're reviewing to go over what we think we should do next. Are you?
We are ready.
I'll stop
All right.
dancing and turn it over.
So this is sort of the workshop agenda concept that we established for the meetings, and we'll probably go through these first few in less than 30 minutes. And since we took a few extra minutes to load the correct PowerPoint presentation, we'll try and just dive right into as quickly as we can the poll for you all to sort of prioritize the discussion topics. So I think we're going to skip the next slide because we already did introductions. So history and purpose, essentially the Trinity County Cannabis Program began in 2016 and was first enacted by Ordinance 815-823. Multiple amendments and updated ordinance have occurred since 2016, and the most recent ordinance was adopted in 2020 along with the completed Cannabis Program final EIR. The purpose of the ordinance is to establish, was initially to establish a cannabis permitting program regulated by the county to allow for a variety of commercial cannabis activities while protecting the public health, safety, and welfare. So one of the things that we've identified more recently in terms of the differing roles and responsibilities between the county's responsibility is the land use authority, and we're also the lead agency for CEQA environmental compliance versus the Department of Cannabis Control, their responsibility is enforcing the state regulations and administering the state licensing program. So that's all for that slide. This is just kind of laying out the fact that between 2016 and 2022, the county adopted 10 standalone ordinances related to commercial cannabis, which you can see on the left-hand side of the screen. And then they're all sort of laid out in a very similar fashion. And so one of the things that we've done in terms of combining all of these ordinances into one ordinance and consolidating the redundant sections is taking, the sections that have the same information or similar information in terms of application requirements, regulations, findings, conditions, things like that, and consolidating them all so there's less redundancy and less pages overall. Next, yep. So we skipped this slide in the last few presentations. So Rick, unless you want me to go through it tonight, we can jump over it, or I can ask the public if you guys want me to detail all of this. But essentially, these are all of the topics that we're going to put up for consideration for you all to poll you all and for you to vote on which topics you think are the highest priority that you'd like to discuss this evening.
On this was a list, and we have presented this in the past, so we probably should do a quick walkthrough, I guess.
Okay.
But actually, rather than just specifically say, let's vote on these and whatever else, I'm just going to ask the audience, what is it you want to focus on? And we can have that up so that people can see it and be reminded. But I think this does help for you to set the stage of some of the main things that, as you said, were problems we were trying to solve and propose solutions so that they have a brief foundation.
Okay, so I'll do my best to move through this quickly, but essentially on this list, the first problem that's identified is that there's no clear mechanism to allow existing licenses to be regulated under the county ordinance per the timeframe that they were approved. So the reference to building code there, to give an example, is that if an applicant were to go to the building department, pull a building permit, and building code changed, once they had received their building permit, the standards that would be applied to their building permit would remain in place even if building code changed. So we basically, one of the suggestions from the Rincon Mentor Harnish team was to establish a non-conforming uses section. So we've established that, and we can certainly have more, question and answers related to why that's there and the function. I kind of touched on this, when I went over the 10 ordinances, but, staff has identified, a number of inconsistencies and conflicting elements between the various ordinance subsections, regulations, and definitions. So we've reorganized the ordinance, consolidated it, and essentially tried to put it all into this same framework. So some examples are, the definitions. We've updated the definitions. Whereas previously each standalone ordinance had a definition at the start of the ordinance, we've now taken each of those 10 separate sets of definitions, consolidated them into one definition section, and similar with fees and enforcement sections. So they've just been consolidated. The regulations often were written in large conceptual language that were difficult to implement or difficult to administer. So we've tried to, simplify them so that the administration of the ordinance, the ordinances and the proposed ordinance is more achievable. Outdated regulations, essentially, over the past 6 going on 7 years since the program was established, the DCC has gone through a number of rule changes. And so we have DCC definition, county definitions that don't match DCC definitions, permit types that didn't exist previously. And so we've tried to just consolidate consolidate what needs to be consolidated, and then update the outdated regulations or reference to outdated regulations from DCC or Water Board or whatever other agencies. More than one cultivation site not allowed. So we've established a stacking section and stacking and criteria for stacked licenses, which essentially means more than one cultivation license per parcel. The lack of allowable zoning in the cultivation ordinance, essentially what we've done is convert the limitation sections to allowable zoning districts, and no new zones were added or removed. We just simply consolidated where some of the ordinance said, cultivation is allowed here, and some of the other ordinances said cultivation is not allowed here. So we've just consolidated those and made them all consistent, but there's no changes to the zoning designations where commercial cannabis activities were previously allowed. This next one, staff has gone through and tried to compare the zoning districts for specific uses and match them with the level of the appropriate discretionary permit. So for example, cultivation is allowed without a use permit where agriculture and dairies are allowed, and storefront retail would be allowed where other storefront retail uses are allowed. So not creating unnecessary barriers for economic development, essentially. The next item is we're essentially proposing new standards or additional standards for suspension and enforcement. So that's included in the suspension, enforcement, revocation, fines section. The next one is lack of criteria for appeals. And so we've established a criteria for appeals that is based on substantial evidence. One of the issues from a staff workload perspective has been that we receive appeals that have oftentimes no basis in fact. And so we are required to take them to the planning commission. So it's a significant burden for staff and really bogs down our ability to process projects and certainly adds a lot more on the agenda for the planning commission, in many cases unnecessarily. So one of the other things that's been consolidated is just the permit requirements. So we've consolidated the current application requirements and sort of identified them by the permit type. One thing that was identified in the last few years was the current ordinance does not allow or does not have a provision for a transfer after someone is deceased. So we added the ability for someone to transfer a license if their family member passes away. So next one is related to the current commercial cultivation variance process. And so what we've proposed is to establish a land use buffer, which I'll probably get into that discussion later when we go through the topics, but essentially the main difference between a setback and a buffer is that a setback is from a property line to within the property. That's the appropriate use of that term. And a buffer is a required distance between two elements. So an element within one parcel to an element on an adjacent parcel. And then, so on the no clear process for opt-out formation or removal, one of the things that Mentir Harnish proposed and that we've included in this proposed ordinance update is to establish exclusionary cannabis overlay zoning districts, which essentially would replace the current opt-out process. If we could even say that we have a established process, which I think there's some question there that needs to be resolved in the future. And then repetitive or outdated regulations, that kind of covered that in a previous topic. So here's just the proposed timeline. Essentially, we are in our third public workshop. As Rick said, we have another one tomorrow in Hayfork at the Fairgrounds Dining Hall, which for those of you that want to attend and don't know, it's basically at the back of the fairgrounds. So you have to take one of the side gates and drive all the way around to the back. That might help you all if you're going to go and you haven't been there before. And also, as Rick said, next Wednesday, Ad hoc has an all-day meeting to go through all the comments received and the input received in these public meetings to kind of make strides towards a more finalized second draft to take to the first reading at the Planning Commission on October the 26th. And then we're shooting to get the second reading of the second draft to the Board of Supervisors on December the 5th. So this is just, again, covering the opportunities for public input. The slide's a little outdated. We've added one more meeting tomorrow night, as stated multiple times. And just so you know, as Rick said, you can give us your written comments to the cannabis.ordinance@trinitycounty.org email address, or up on the front table there are comment cards. If you'd like to fill out a comment card and leave it with staff tonight, we'd be glad to receive your comments and include them in our discussions. So this is the list of public engagement topics that we're going to poll. And Rick, I don't know if you're ready for me to turn it back over to you, or you want me to read these off? You guys can all see them up on the screen.
Yeah, I think if we just leave those up there, I'll take it. I do want to just reach out, and Trent, if you're still on, maybe you can kind of give us a signal as if you'd like to say anything as we dig in. I did want to make comments to folks here. We've kind of alluded to this, but the ad hoc committee has been meeting for some months now on an almost weekly basis, and we would basically bring up topics that we knew needed to be addressed in some fashion, and we would try to work those. And sometimes, like we've done in these meetings, we'd spend a whole 2 hours on one topic. And then as we got to a certain point, we said, we can keep working on this document, and no matter how good we think it is, we're going to get public feedback that will tell us we need to make some changes. So rather than try to go closer to perfection, let's get this out there as a clear working draft, knowing it has blemishes. We haven't had time to review and discuss every single part of this in the ad hoc committee. So this is very valuable to us to get. And I just want to put that out there that what you're seeing is truly a working draft. And we did this because we wanted to have these kinds of engagement opportunities, and we felt it was better to get it sooner rather than later. So this feedback, again, is very, very helpful. Did Trent give an indication? Or do I just, Trent, if you're unmuted, do you want to let us know if you'd like to say something?
No, good. I'm good, Rick. Thanks for the opportunity. You guys just keep going.
Okay, thank you, sir. Okay, so these areas that we just sort of went through in some fashion, these were some of the areas that we thought people might really want to weigh in on, that they would like to talk about. So what we're going to do, you can call out one of those, you can call out something else. I'm going to write down the things that I'm hearing from you that you want to talk about, and then we're going to take show of hands kind of vote to decide the order in which we tackle them. And ideally, we get to a whole bunch of things, but we'll see how the evening goes. Veronica. Oh, and I'm sorry, and Veronica, because I missed her one time, or one or more times last time. But if you're raising your hand, wait till I kind of make eye contact with you, and I know I've seen you, and then I'll try to remember the order. But because I think Veronica was going like this, and I would be looking away. So, yes.
I would like to talk about establish allowable zoning that's comparable to similar activities in zoning districts.
Okay, what do you really want to talk about?
I want to talk about the fact that I don't believe they have similar business uses, and something that's brought up consistently is what other business do we do this to? I would also like to take into account that what other business is still federally illegal.
Okay.
And it's something that is important to be part of the conversation if we're going to say what other things. But my main subject on this is I do not think that there are some zoning that should have a right to use, I think is the language you used in a meeting recently, Bonnie. I do still think that direct, I'm now of the effect that a CUP should be more equitable for conversation than director's permits or director's use permits. But I do still think those types of use permits need to stay in play in some zoning because it allows that additional conversation to take place, like even for stores.
Okay, so for right now, we're getting the subject. So, okay, and I will, encourage us to make sure what we really want to be focusing on is there something about the ordinance that you want to either ask a question about so you better understand, raise a concern about so that you know that you have a concern, we know that you have a concern, or that you have a suggestion for a change. So in this case, for the similar use zoning, I just put it up here, you would like to talk about how that's in here and a concern or a question or okay, all right. And then I also heard director's use permit versus conditional use permit and the ministerial approach.
Allowed by right.
Okay. Yes, sir. Okay. The question has come up, can we share the mic? And I can try to do that so that people, instead of me having to repeat everything you say, they can hear you when you ask it. So we'll try that. We couldn't do that last time because I didn't have a wireless mic. So yes, sir.
I have a concern, suggestions about the appeal criteria.
Okay. Who's next? Yes.
This isn't specifically in reference to the ordinance, but I would like to talk about the timeline that we're working in.
The whole timeline for the ordinance review, approval, all that kind of stuff. Okay. I'm just going to put timeline. That's pretty broad, but we'll get us there.
To talk about the timeline too, maybe just that I feel like it's a really short time period put on staff to be able to bring all of this together.
Okay. Anybody else? Another subject right here and then right here.
The overlay exclusion overlay.
Okay. And I can remember that one, so let me get yours while I'm here.
Micro business zoning questions.
Okay, and Drew, or Bella, while I'm writing this down, the micro business came up. Can you just explain micro business so that people have that while I'm tackling this?
I apologize. I didn't hear the question, but
Explain what micro business means in our world.
micro business is essentially a term that I believe was established by the Department of Cannabis, well, previously the CDFA, or the Bureau of Cannabis Control, now the Department of Cannabis Control, that essentially, I believe, was a mechanism to allow small cannabis operators to get closer to having a vertically integrated business model. And so they can essentially have multiple license types that allow them to cultivate, distribute, and do retail potentially. So currently, we don't allow retail with our micro business, but the state does. So I don't know if that helps clarify. enough.
Okay, and we'll, we can dig in if we get there, or when we get there, hopefully, Tom.
I'm thinking, and maybe I'm reaching here, that we could envelop stacking into the use zoning conversation. I don't want to divert that conversation, but maybe we don't need a standalone stacking. We can fit it under there if we can.
Then stacking, okay. So I will put it right up next to it, and then we can figure out if they're together or not. Anybody else? Yes, sir.
In the license to permit transition duration, and then this ties into what Veronica said with use by right for land use based stuff such as this within the county, not just, this goes beyond cannabis stuff, but specifically for cannabis. Since we're here with that tonight, I would also like to touch on what Steve brought up with the micro business. I feel like that's super important for many of the, businesses that operate within cannabis in Trinity County. And then also on Veronica's discussion of the DUP versus CUP and allowable by right. Just poor policy got us to here. So I'm hopeful on the top of that list Drew had up that by consolidating the ordinances, we can have a better, for everybody in this room, a better functioning, cannabis ordinance. So I'm definitely hopeful for that.
Thank you. No, you bet. And so it sounded like everything that you're interested in is up here. You're just trying to emphasize and clarify.
Transition from license to permit, what exactly that entails, and if that allows use by right and information of the basically the roll in the dice every year, like you're without license to sheriff department.
Okay, for those who were unable to hear because I was writing while he was clarifying, what I've added is that license to permit transition, sort of how that's going to work, and also the duration associated with some of those things. And so I think I've got that. All right, hold on a minute.
Establish allowable zoning, and how does that compare with the general plan that's coming up?
Okay, so establish allowable zoning and relation of that to the general plan. I think it's time for a new sheet. So allowable zoning versus general plan. And for those who aren't aware, I mentioned briefly about the general plan and some changes we went through today. This week, when we had a board meeting, we were being asked to approve some things that we determined during the meeting actually needed to go back through to the planning commission for a formal recommendation before we were reviewing it. And so we do have these two processes that very much have linkages taking place at the same time.
I'd also like to talk about the consolidated enforcement and the definitions and procedures for the enforcement.
So specifically, when you talk about definitions and procedures for the enforcement. Okay. So enforcement discussion. Okay, anything else? Anything?
Will those people be able to continue working under the rules?
Okay. So, and Drew and Bella, the way I mentioned that so that you can try to make sure if we get to that, how we deal with was kind of like, what is the impact on in-process applications? People have applied for something now with what we have in place. We come up with something new before their application is processed, what happens?
Okay.
So if we get there, that's what I think I've just teed up. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I would like to see something take place like what happened with me in about 77, 78. I raised hogs. And there was an inspector that came around maybe every year, maybe every 9 months, and checked to see if there was a smell, if there was water being contaminated and this type of stuff. I think this needs to be placed on pot growing in any way, shape, or form. I think it should be taken where there's water is tested below these places that are growing. I think it should be tested on the same basis as you would with the inspection of the animals or.
And I just have to interrupt because we're not going to get into the discussion right now, but what is the subject? So the subject is about inspections of the cultivation operations. That's the subject. Okay, thank you. And is there something changing in the ordinance about that? Because we already do have inspections and so forth called for in the processes anyway. Is there something about the ordinance where that's changing? Just while I'm writing it down?
There are some, I wouldn't say they're changes, but there are some potential updates, and I'm happy to sort of explain that when we get to that topic.
And my scribble says inspections related to cannabis operations. Okay. All right. So here's how this works. We use the honor system. And this is a struggle for some people because I saw them trying to take back their votes so they could use it again later. But what I'm going to ask you is think of the top 3 items to you, because I'm going to ask you when I go through each one, I want to see a raise of hands of which one you think is the most important for us to discuss. And you get to only vote 3 times. And we won't only cover 3 subjects, but you just get 3 votes. And ideally we get to everything, but this helps us get to the ones first. So we have stacking, similar use zoning, DUP versus CUP allowed by right, the appeal criteria, the overall timeline, micro business issues, overlay zones, the license permit transition and duration, the allowable zoning versus general plan, enforcement matters, impact on in-process applications that came over Zoom, and inspections for cannabis operations. So, oh, yes. Okay, hold on just a minute. I've got a question.
In-process applications, sorry. Does that go towards the applications for opt-outs as well?
We can add that in there too, yes. So the question was, if we're talking about in-process applications, would that include the in-hand or in-process applications or requests for opt-outs? Okay, we can fold that in there. Another question?
Similar use zoning and DUP versus CUP could be rolled together because they're in the same vein of that's on the documents provided to us, because it's part of that paragraph.
Okay.
So we don't
That
have
was
to.
my comment.
then we don't have to
Same.
vote.
And
She said
Yeah.
both of those things, and it's kind of the same thing that she wanted to talk about. I don't feel like
any other questions before we do our show of hands? Yes.
So overlay zones is the same, excuse me, as the opt-outs, what we call opt-outs.
Yeah. So the question was, is when we talk about overlay zones here, does that also relate to opt-outs? And yes, that is. Yes, it's opt-outs, opt-ins, basically, yes. Inclusionary zones or exclusionary zones. Okay, so think about your top three. I'm going to ask for the votes. We'll just start over here. So votes for stacking. Okay. We had for online, that was 0. Similar use zoning, DUP, CUP, allowable by rights, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. Appeal criteria, 1, 2, whoa, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Okay, that's our number 1 so far. Timeline, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And just for clarity's sake, this isn't staff voting, they're reflecting the online votes. Micro business, 1, 2, 5. Overlay zones, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. New number 1, license, permit, transition, and then I think it was not the duration of the transition, but the duration of the permits once they're issued. Correct. Yeah, that was the main thing. Any hands? 1 and 0 in line. Okay. And again, I should mention one of the other things that we're going to try to do. We're not only getting comments and suggestions and so forth, concerns, we're also getting questions. And another thing that we're trying to tackle amongst rewriting the ordinance for a second draft is frequently asked questions. So we'll try to take some of those questions and put in writing the answers so that everybody can have those. So please don't feel like if you've raised a question and we don't get it to it tonight, you're never going to hear from us. We really do want to use this as an opportunity to learn what people want to know more about and provide more clarity. Okay, allowable zoning versus general plan. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Enforcement. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 10. I can't remember, that was 10 or 11, but we're still in the top 3. We'll get there. Impact on in-process applications. 1, 2, 3, 4. And the last one, inspections for cannabis operations. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And did you have your hand up or did you already use your vote? No. Yeah. Okay. So I think 8. And do we have any there? Okay. All right. So that means this is, say, overlay zones, teeing up staff. Drew, if you guys want to start getting the slides ready and so forth, we're going to do overlay zones first. That's number 1.
Okay.
The appeal criteria is number 2. Enforcement is number 3. Inspections is number 4. DUP, CUP, all those fun things. Number 5. And then we have a 3-way tie. We'll figure that one out when we get there. Okay, so what we'll start with is we'll let staff kind of take us through this a little bit in a little bit more detail. And then again, I'll raise your hand. I'll call on, again, questions, concerns, suggestions, and then we'll try to engage in that conversation. So turn it over to staff.
All right. So essentially, the exclusionary overlay zone concept was provided to us by the Mentor Harnish Rincon team And it's commonly used practice in other jurisdictions as part of the planning process to essentially opt out of some particular land use activity type. And so one of the things that has been identified is that the current opt-outs, my understanding is that many of them were established originally as urgency ordinances and then were codified subsequently. And so the intent is really to establish a clear process by which the pending requests and future requests would have a process to comply with, such as a proper application and all of the other things that would go along with any other, county process. I don't know if there are more sort of specific questions that we could get into, but that's the sort of a general overview.
Thank you, Drew. I'm sure we'll be getting into a lot of these questions. So again, I think this is probably a good example of one where we are clearly going to have differences of opinions. And I just call on people to respect the time that each person has to offer their opinion, and you will have yours. And we'll jump in. Who wants to raise a question or comment or concern about this part?
If I could have a quick comment on what Drew just said. These allowable zones were done to bring in illegal grows into legal compliance. They were not, to make a correction, for future use. And that has been the catalyst, so to speak. And the big fight is, okay, we have all these rural residential areas that are residential areas and not to be allowed for commercial business use. But because we had an established or tried to establish this cannabis program, we all got together and said, okay, the ones that are there now will allow. The big conversation and debate has been the future. What will be allowed? Well, the big fight basically was, wow, now you have all these new people coming into residential areas that we didn't think about. That was one of the reasons why this ordinance is so controversial. It's still rural residential. We allowed it to allow these illegal grows to become legal, but not to be a commercial operations in our rural residential. Rural residential for
So
the rest of us is residential, not just rural residential.
Yeah.
Not allowed in Weaverville or in the towns, residential areas for obvious reasons.
And I'm sorry, I'm just interrupting because I really want to make sure that we focus on what is it about the ordinance that you want to suggest or question or raise a concern about. I'm hearing the background and your perspective and all that kind of stuff, but we have to.
That it wasn't for the future as mentioned by the director.
Okay. So, and again, I just want to make sure I'm capturing. So from, this is all about the overlay zones. And just a comment that our, I guess what I'm going to take is our approach should reflect original intent. Is that fair of what you were trying to get across? And again, I apologize for, I don't like to interrupt folks because I want it in engagement, but I also need to keep us very focused. Okay, I'll be right back up front.
So will the new ordinance, are the opt-out zones as they are now, are they going to be grandfathered? Or will that, under the new ordinance, the whole process have to start again, as in your last paragraph there?
And I think, and Dan, you've been around in this, maybe the longest of all of us in this room. Bella, you've been here through the whole thing too. We do, can we clarify, we have, in my mind, two different types of opt-out zones. There were some that were just sort of, hey, we have these boundaries, these districts, these whatever, that we're going to say are opt-outs. And then there were petition-driven opt-outs. So if you can first just clarify that and then answer the question. Thank you.
Rick was correct in the description of how opt-outs were formed. There was the original opt-outs in the original ordinance that was, and other people were there. I was still in college at that time. But that were based on other district boundaries. And then there was subsequent petitions for other communities that also wanted to be in opt-outs, that followed urgency ordinances that then were turned into permanent ordinances. And then to your question, I don't have an answer to that. I believe that's going to be up to the board or the planning commission.
So the ordinance doesn't say.
No, it does
one way or
not
the
clarify that at all.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
Or
the
it
ord-
doesn't
so
outline that.
Yeah, so the ordinance does not specifically say what happens to existing, and which would mean if it's not clarified, which it could be, that could be an outcome that we would clarify it in the ordinance, but otherwise it would be up to planning commission, board, all those sorts of things. Anything else? Bill?
Yeah, I just wanted to add one more thing. And what Drew was trying to speak to earlier is that all we've done is outlined a process for future opt-outs or opt-ins that are not already accounted for in our opt-outs already. That makes sense, because there are other communities that have petitioned already, but we need to have a clear process to go forward with.
And somebody made the point at one of the previous meetings that, why do we need an opt-in when in general, if it's not saying you can't do it, then you can. But the answer was this kind of came from areas that maybe there are parts of an area that is currently restricted from doing it that would like to go through the same process that residents have gone through to create an opt-out to say, we want to be able to opt back in. And so they would have a process that is the same as for the other way. So I think, Crystal, I saw your hand up, or did I? But I didn't. Okay, sorry about that.
I think the confusion lies in the fact that there are areas in the existing license types that are being merged in that do have the exclusions in that. So there's a supposed expectation that since it is in the ordinance, that's not going to go away and it's not being changed.
So you're talking about things that are currently excluded in an opt-out that you see permits or areas and permit. Okay.
There's areas that are noted in the license types as being exclusion areas. In other words, you can't conduct that business in this area. And so I think there's a general assumption that those aren't being proposed to be changed. Would that be true?
So I think I can maybe clarify for you a little bit that this section, as far as cannabis exclusion overlay zones, has no bearing on the existing zoning designations that currently allow for whatever license type. So this is the whole function of this section, is to establish a clear criteria and process to establish new exclusionary zones or opt-ins or opt-outs, if you want to use those terms.
And maybe specific to what I was hearing, there was, and Bella had mentioned, I think earlier, that what we were trying, or you did, I get confused. What we were trying to do was move away from, we have some things where we say what we can't do, and we have some things say what we can do, and we want to get to, this is the appropriate areas to do this. But to
so-
the extent we do that, if we say these permits are allowed in these areas and whatever other restrictions, that does not override an opt-out or overlay zone. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, so just again to clarify, as I understand it, the existing opt-outs are related to cultivation licenses.
Some
storefront.
Yeah, some opt-outs go beyond just cultivation.
So this whole section, if what we're talking about is, page 18 of this proposed first draft, this only is intended to establish criteria for how applications and for opt-outs or opt-ins would be accepted and processed going forward.
Okay, and so it doesn't, if a opt-out, we'll call it for now, is in place and it has things that are excluded, that's not changed by this.
Correct.
What could be is in a new opt-out, as it's going through this process, it would fall under this new criteria, this new process, this new everything.
Yes.
Okay, and Did that, Crystal, did that answer that question, or do you have something different? Oh, let me come back then. Oh, okay, if it's on the same thing, go ahead.
Because then I think we should add a section that defines how that will function for those that are in the current opt-outs. So have some kind of definition on how that's going to happen. Because, and then when you say, see like 315, the Rush Creek and Lewiston expansion opt-out, there's a situation right now where that approved ordinance has a section in there that says every one of these license types need to be amended. It shows where they need to be amended, and that never got incorporated into the existing ones that are being utilized and transferred into this document.
Okay. So you're saying that things that were reflected in what has been approved in the past are not reflected in what is being described going forward? Okay.
May I ask for clarification? Crystal, are you saying that from the original ordinances, there were criteria that weren't established into what is now 1743? That's what I understand you to be
That's what I
saying.
heard, yes.
Okay.
And which I think that's what I heard you say too, that you're not trying to change what was done with previous ones, but you are trying to establish how things work going forward.
Agreed.
For new.
Yep.
And that is still up for input about how it should work, but that's what you're trying to clarify.
So Crystal, if you can either, I mean, you can, give your comment verbally, but if you want to just send that in an email to the email address and actually give us the sections of the original ordinances that you think were left out, that would be a great way for us to take in that information and try and incorporate it.
Okay, I'm finally back to you.
Yeah, no worries. I just have a question, I guess, broader than cannabis. Is this paving a template for how the county will address opt-in, opt-out of any issue? As Veronica said, nothing is treated this way, but if we start to establish within cannabis, and maybe this is getting beyond what we're here to talk about tonight, but I feel like this is more of a CCR, based issue rather than necessarily county. But if we do establish it for cannabis, is that going to go beyond cannabis into planning?
I would say that, it would at least provide a framework for, hopefully a successful methodology and process to establish exclusionary zones, but it would not set that precedent or make that, wouldn't put that into effect for any other process unless it was codified somewhere else in Trinity County Code.
Yeah, and I think to build on that, this is a cannabis ordinance, so it would be specific to that, but I hear what you're saying is, but should that be for consistency, a way in which things like that would be dealt with? And then I think that comes back to the comment about, well, how does this fall into the general plan? Because that's where land use is all supposed to be. So I'm going to go here and here and.
And then just going to pave the way for that and other issues outside of cannabis, I guess.
Okay.
And then I did have one other question. In regards to the opt-in, that's not just opting in for current licensed use. I believe that's like discussing opting back in like a generation from now. Is that the impression that I'm under as population shift, views change, that's establishing precedent for communities to then retroactively change? Yeah, okay, I just wanted to clarify.
Okay.
I could.
Yeah, it's just, it was simply saying, if
Wanna add
you're
my
going to have one, then have the other, but have it a formalized process, because as Drew was kind of alluding to, while we have had several go through this petition-driven approach, and they've been somewhat similar, that is not a formal documented process that we can point to and tell people, this is it, see here, do it this way. And so that we're trying to get to that place. So it's a little more fair, if you will.
I'll use the mic if you want, but oh, you can't? May I?
So for consistency's sake, at last week's meeting, there was discussion that was entertained by staff about how it was a possibility to have the current opt-out zones start fresh and start over and pay for rezone and go through this new process. So it was a discussion we had last week that it could, I watched the tape again, that it could be a possibility that the current opt-out areas may be reconsidered moving forward in new ordinances. So I just wanted to bring that out. And going back to Crystal's question, what I think I hear, and it could be wrong, when they got that opt-out, at that time, it was the time that, like a budget adjustment. An ordinance adjustment was, it sounds like, was supposed to be made at that time with the new language, is what I'm hearing from her, and it never made it to move forward into this new language, rather than what was in the original language, because it wasn't. Because as you said, there's no opt-out. So I think that's more what she's talking about, but I could be wrong. It happens.
And I think, I think it's good that we had the clarification that what I'm hearing, the ordinance does not address what would happen to existing. So that isn't a fair statement. They could have to do it, but this is not trying to, let's not. Okay.
And
I just wanted to add one thing that I added to the other workshops was a general description of, as planning works, there's the general plan designation, and from there you have your zoning districts. And then in specific cases, we have something that's called an overlay zone. And that's where this would come in. So it's following a rezone process. And usually if anybody wants to rezone their parcel, or if they want to remove an overlay or whatever it is, the property owner can request that, and it would be at cost of the applicant or applicants. And that was on the slide. I just wanted to go over that kind of layer of zoning that exists. And that's the model that we're trying to add that is in other counties and other northern counties.
Okay, thank you. I think Stephen, then back here. Please go ahead.
Oh, I just had a, how are you going to deal with these legal boundaries? It's kind of subjective. So are you really going to be able to isolate down overlays in the future to be done by legal boundaries such as a water district, as opposed to a general neighborhood that has gotten together as we did, that there wasn't a legal boundary, it was a consensus of a certain area.
So yeah, this is in C2, and it does talk about legal boundaries, and this has come up in other meetings. And one of the things that came up is a parcel boundary is a legal boundary, but is it by this definition? So there is a need for clarity about what is being included in allowable legal boundaries. And so that has already been brought up and will be being addressed. So yes, now, thank you for your patience.
Sure, no worries. My understanding of that part is just to make sure that the boundaries don't cut across parcels, and that it seems to be like something definable, like a road or a district, and not just cutting across random zones. But hopefully there's some clarification on that. So I have a comment and I guess a request. My comment is that I think that the various opt-outs all came about by mostly differing processes and differing requirements. And the purpose of the new overlay zones is to have one process for all of these. I do think it's absolutely appropriate for the existing opt-outs to come into compliance with the new ordinance, just as all the existing cannabis farms are going to have to come into compliance with this new ordinance. So should the opt-out zones. As they move into overlay zones, the new requirements of, was it 50% of the land, 60% of the residents? Is it residents or people?
Property owners, I think. Is that the way?
Is it property owners? So not actually residency. I think that would help really take some of the confusion that's come up over the years with all these. And my other request is that I'm curious if there's been an opinion from county council on the constitutionality of creating opt-out zones for allowable uses in allowable zones. Some of the other counties have used zoning to restrict use in zones, but now we're taking overlays. I don't know, it's confusing. I would love to see a county council opinion that kind of explains some of that at some point.
Okay, so Dan, I don't know if there's anything about that you want to weigh in on, but I think what I want to identify is that I feel like I've heard two opposing, or at least not completely aligned views about implementation of overlay zones. And one is to say the overlay zones that are in existence should not be touched. They should, this should all be about new. And then I'm hearing well, we should go back and look at the existing opt-outs and see if they meet the new criteria that is in there, which is that thing like 60% of the people in the area signed and, or however we require it, and 50% of the land and so forth. So it's just two different opinions that we're hearing. And I want to make sure that I capture that for us, because I think that's consistent with what we've heard at the other meetings too. There are some people who say, wait a minute, we worked really hard to get that. We had 60, 70% of the people sign. We shouldn't have to go back through this again. And then you have others saying, well, if this is what we think the criteria is, should be going forward, shouldn't we kind of look back and make sure that fits? So I'm just recognizing opinions because that's what we're here to do. And I'm sorry, but I feel like I've missed some hands. Okay.
Just a quick comment on the overlay zones, and not all of the existing carve-outs were petition driven, right? So those are based on water board enrollment and such. So that also might come into consideration. I'm more in favor, like what Steve said, of being, I guess, what do I say, consistent in how you implement ordinances and how we need to still follow new ones, even if maybe in the past you didn't have to, especially since there wasn't anything that was codified for how the opt-outs were created. So.
Thank you. And Dan, I don't know if you even caught what I was teeing up for you if you wanted to, but that was that question about county council having weighed in on the legality of these kind of like opt-out zones and those sorts of things. And I know we generally don't try to speak for county council, but you've been around for this for a long time, planning commission board. Is there anything about that you wanted to say, or we'll just take it as a question?
I'll just take it as a question for now.
Okay.
It happens. There are other exclusionary overlays for things besides. There are exclusionary overlays for things besides cannabis. It is a planning tool. That's why Bella's trying to go to that instead of an opt-out area as an exclusionary zone. It's actually a real thing. So there is precedent for that.
Did you have your hand up?
I did. I'm concerned that the process of starting an exclusionary zone, in that process, let's say I submit to Drew that this neighborhood is going to apply for opt-out. If there needs to be something in the code that says, okay, no new licenses can be accepted while this process is ongoing, because we've run into these problems where, like Lewiston, they started the process and they kept delaying that process, the board and the commission and the staff. And so it took 2 years. In the meantime, they start processing 4 to 5 to 6 new licenses in that area, which is, problematic. So can we have something in the ordinance that prevents staff from giving out licenses once an application has been submitted? Not a complete application, but an intent. So that would stop that problem.
So the feedback is to say, and relating to some recent examples where applications submitted, or I guess we'll call it an application application for an opt-out submitted, and in a similar time frame, applications for cultivation submitted. And so this particular input is to say, if there is a submitted application for an opt-out, that should trigger a no processing of cultivation or whatever other cannabis related permits in that area until that's resolved. Is that what you're saying? Okay, so
Rick,
that's what.
Rick, if I may, I just want to clarify too that, they took so long too because there was no process. So adding the process would hopefully reduce the time, but time is always set up by a number of complex factors. But just to reiterate what you're saying, the term that sometimes uses a moratorium on new applications. So that's a suggestion that we'll take in, of course. I mean, everything we're taking in, but I'm just repeating it in a planning term.
And then I'd also like to just clarify, although I think we've been over it. Essentially, again, this is just establishing a process to create future exclusionary zones. And we certainly will have, kind of to your question, Steve, we certainly will have county council's input to this document before it goes to the planning commission. Ultimately, as we've said, it's going to be a board level decision related to how this transitions, what happens to the existing opt-outs, and to the question of, can there be a moratorium or something like that? I imagine that's a legal question, which we will most certainly ask to county council when we get there.
Yeah. Okay. So what I captured though is how are potentially conflicting applications addressed? Are there moratoriums and so forth? And I have to see some other hands, so we'll go there. And then, so I've got two up here, and then Tom, I see you. Whoever wants to go first.
Okay.
You're gonna go first?
You can go first.
Okay, so the only thing I see with this putting a moratorium on while somebody's in process is that like they could just be in process of creating an opt-out zone in perpetuity. And that seems like a pretty big problem that, we'd have to put a time limit on it or something like, oh, you've put in your appointment card that says you are in process of creating an opt-out zone, but they couldn't just say for the next 30 years, they're still in process of creating an opt-out zone, that it would, surely there would have to be some sort of time limit on that. And yes, of course, I agree that legality should be discussed with the.
As we're pertaining to new permits, I just want to bring up that county council has brought this up, that the WDID that grandfathers you in to the water discharge ID number that grandfathers you in to be able to get a license in an opt-out zone. The water discharge ID number is attached to a parcel, not an individual, and not a license. This is grandfathered land use. This is clarified by county council that didn't even have to be kept current, that you only had to enroll by specified date. I would just like to say that that's what county council clarified.
And it's true that would work both ways.
Correct.
The
Yeah.
Current grandfathers would have to lose their grandfather if we started the process all over again.
I don't agree with that statement.
If one loses it, the other.
Well, we have,
Possibility.
That's not the way it's presented in the draft ordinance, just
I
so
have
you're
more to
clear.
say,
So
but
if you
I
want to
wanna-
clarify your comment in terms of your suggestion, that we would be happy to receive that. But what you're stating is a misconception.
Okay, so I'll come back to that. So I just want to make sure, Matt, because this is some terminology that I'm not necessarily familiar with. So this WDID is something, it's water related. And if you have that creates an exception that would allow you to cultivate within an existing opt-out zone. And those are tied to the property. Oh, okay. So for some opt-out zones, this particular criteria was written in. So I'm just trying to make sure we were understanding what we're capturing.
WDIDs. I have one of the WDIDs by November of 2017 by a certain date, and that grandfathers my parcel into grandfathered land use. The discharger can change multiple times. It's the parcel that's enrolled with the WDID number. That's
because usually everything is tied to the permit and the permit holder, not the parcel owner.
So
Yeah,
that
it's
brings up an interesting sort of point for clarification in terms of this first draft, which is that currently the ordinance says uses the term applicant, but then you are correct, Matt, that the WDID is associated with a parcel and has a location ID with the water board. So that grandfathered, enrollment in the water board can't be moved to another parcel, but we do need to clarify whether or not it remains with an applicant or remains with the site under a new applicant.
Yeah, the water board.
Yeah.
Says it remains with the
Yeah.
property.
Okay, so go ahead.
So I'm going to take a couple minutes. I'm speaking for an unspoken community right now. I'm speaking for the North Lake cannabis community. I'd like to say too that I fully respect, I'm going to use Rush Creek Road as an example. They had like 95% of the road that wanted to opt out of cannabis. I respect the right to do that. I fully respect that. I think it's a good definable zone. But when we're talking about Coffee Creek and Trinity Center, these opt-outs are completely false and unsubstantiated. It's hundreds of square miles and it did not meet any of this criteria. I personally believe that these should not be turned into exclusion zones, that individual neighborhoods there should have to go through the same criteria that everybody else has to go through. You know, they speak to that it's high density population areas, and that just doesn't exist in North Lake. All of the spaces that are in North Lake that are high population density zones that are neighborhoods, these are all actually very close to the lake. They all are in the federal recreation area. They cannot get a license. Most of all of this is within 1,000 feet of the school. All of the high population density areas in North Lake are completely excluded from any kind of permitting or any kind of cannabis licensing of any kind. Basically, this is only affecting the legacy growers in our community. It's affecting only the people that are miles up dirt roads. I want to apologize too that I brought a little too much emotion into this last week, and I'm trying to keep myself collected, and I appreciate your time. This is really disenfranchising our community, not allowing us to participate in the cannabis industry. It has increased our private property crime and theft. It's running the working class and the youth out of our community. My parcel was robbed last winter that I don't grow cannabis on. That's a parcel that I grow food on. When the cops came to my parcel, they said 70 to 80% of the private property theft happens in North Lake. I attribute that to the fact that the vast majority of the homes in North Lake are second residence homes. And this is very strongly disenfranchising our community. We have a community right now that is not able to have their water system functioning because they cannot qualify for grants because they have too many second residence homes in their community. The impact that this opt-out zone is doing is it's restricting industry and it's restricting our ability to have jobs.
And I just need to acknowledge, I cut off somebody earlier because it was getting into a lot of opinion about stuff versus specific to the ordinance. And
what I'm specifically talking to is the health and human safety, that the reason that this opt-out zone is being put in is because of health and human safety. And I want to bring up the concerns about health and human safety. And no jobs means no families, and Coffee Creek School is about to shut down because we don't have families. And this was decided by Taurus and a bunch of residents of Lewiston. There's like 10 people in North Lake that don't want commercial cannabis. And it's strongly supported in North Lake, and I have more to say, but I wanted.
Thank you, Matt. And no, that's okay. I get it. And we all are bringing emotions and history with us. I think what is clear is we've already raised this question about how existing opt-outs are impacted right now. The ordinance does not address that. It doesn't say, it just says this is new. But that overlay zone is about opting in or opting out, if you will. It's inclusionary or exclusionary. So that would be one means in which this ordinance would allow that to be addressed. Just okay. Okay, so I've noted TCCC, so specifically calling out that input that at least one person would really like to see that not be just automatically carried forward. Okay, thank you. And Tom, I think you were next, and then David, I know you said something I didn't capture, so I'll come back.
Thanks. As regards opt-outs that exist, I'm going to put them into two categories. One I will call statutory opt-outs, which were the result of what some of us called the Belenko Compromise, that wrote opt-outs into the original ordinance. That's the North Lake, that's Weaverville CSD, it's the Ruth Lake Estates, and it was Hayfork until that was opted back in. Leave those as they are.
Give them to me again.
That's North Lake, which I don't exactly remember how it's termed, but it's like Trinity Center and Coffee Creek CSD, I think. It's Weaverville CSD. It's the original Lewiston. And it's the Ruth Lake Estates.
And you said it was Hayfork, but they opted back in.
Correct. All of those have that WDID grandfathering that Matt's talking about, because it's written into those carve-outs. If you're in the water board by X date, most of it, I think, is December 31st of 2016, but there's a couple, it's in the ordinance, but it's in those ones. Then we have Rush Creek Estates, Bucktail, and the Lewiston expansion, which is the Grass Valley Creek area. Plus all the pending ones. I'm going to call those population driven or popular. Let's call them because they're all petition.
Petition driven, but
Let's call them petition driven. Yeah. Bucktail is in the original. The only one of those that I think should be revisited under the new criteria, and I think that it should, and I like the new criteria. As you remember from last meeting, I would prefer this was all a standalone ordinance, but I get it. If we're going to put it in here, I think the new criteria is appropriate, that 50%, 60%. And I think the option to opt in or opt out is also appropriate. I've always had a problem with how the Lewiston expansion takes the votes of a very small RR section. I mean, lots of people, small landmass. RR 2.5, RR 1, RR 5. And it wipes out these huge swaths of ag and ag forest. Ag 10, Ag 20, Ag Forest 40 are all part of this exclusionary zone. I think that we can leave it as a tentative while we evaluate that. But I think that expansion zone carve out should be evaluated under these criteria. Where do we have that 50, 60? Because I think we would probably see an adjustment of the borders there. And I think that was probably an appropriate adjustment. Obviously, the main driving force here is RR. We don't want this in small RR parcels. And that's, I think that is the engine here. But when it bleeds over into things like, oh, you can't do it on your Ag 20, there is not that much ag land in Trinity County. And this is an agricultural product. So if there's a region where it doesn't work, like I think what we're going to see out of Hettinshaw might wipe out some ag properties. But I think the criteria is important to shore up these zones so that should they be challenged, we at least have evaluated them through this very strong criteria that if we applied that to any other method like general plan or election would probably carry the day. And I know probably most of the people in favor of exclusionary areas here are part of the Lewiston expansion area, the one I'm talking about, but I think that's the only one that of the existing expansions that I see controversy in.
Okay, so this has come up a couple of times, and I know this is, what I'm gonna do is ask for sort of show of hands of which way people lean on this particular subject. And I do have to acknowledge that I haven't predetermined, well, what is the kind of predisposition of the people here towards being in the cultivation arena or being outside of it. But still, just for the people that are here, get a sense of this. So one side of this is to say, all of everything about the overlay zone should be about new and nothing looking back. So the existing opt-outs are just basically codified in, and new opt-ins or opt-outs, exclusion, exclusion is what gets weighed in by the new program. That's one approach. And the other is that this criteria gets retroactively applied to, well, either the statutory original or the petition driven. So it's like, do you think that these should be revetted against the new criteria, or do you think they should be left alone? So If you think they should be revetted, raise your hand. So I'm getting 5, 6, 7, some hands, 8, 9. Okay, and those that think they should be left alone? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Okay, thanks. So hopefully you guys captured that. I'm not going to do exact numbers, but, and again, we asked some similar questions the other day, and I realized that there were probably 3 people in the room that weren't in the cultivation business. And so, it's not surprising that every hand from the non-cultivation went up one way and everybody in cultivation went another way, but it still helps me to just get a sense of where people stand. So I'll go here and then back here.
We've written this like Seabiscuit now, so I just, within the same vein though, on the new, I like the exclusionary overlay idea. I feel like it does fit a lot of the criteria. My concerns are the cost for a neighborhood with the, what it would cost to do the rezoning and all of that. That should be, because we're not, people in that area aren't trying to start an industry or a business. They're just trying to have, peaceful, quiet enjoyment of parcel or life. So just when you start looking at that, just something to keep in mind as you move forward on that idea.
Yes, sir.
I think it would seem appropriate that any of the opt-outs, revetting, could maybe have the fees waived. Seems like an,
If they were revetted.
fees should obviously be waived.
Okay.
Okay, I had a question here on the 50% of property owners. Can we get some clarification on what that means? Like if the property is just in one person's name, do they just get one vote? Like my wife and I, it's me and her. So do we get 2 votes? Sometimes people have, Bob or Judy. Is that, and then what if Bob owns 3 parcels? Does Bob get 3 votes, 1 for each parcel? So can we just get some clarification very, very specifically on what a property owner vote entails?
I think it's a really good idea for however we're going to do this. We have to be very, very specific and clear. So I see them capturing those notes. So I saw a hand here, I think, and then I do want to acknowledge we are an hour and a half in on subject 1. So do you want to wrap this up with the next couple of statements and move on to number 2? Let me see. Let me just see a show of hands for who wants to move forward. Okay, so I will take the 3 hands I saw up.
Okay, I had a question regarding the findings that the Board of Supervisors has to make in order to approve a new exclusionary zone. And I was concerned about the sentence about it will not have adverse social equity outcomes that will inhibit general community access to opportunities and outcomes. And I'm like, what's the metric for that? And how do you even prove it? And then also it talks about impaired public resources or odor smells. Again, what are the metrics? How are we going to prove that?
So Bella, are you clear with which section she's on? So if you can, I see you, Rhoda, and yes. So if you can just take a second to, I think I've heard this before. It's like, what does this mean?
So what I can say is that essentially this is language that's been adapted from use in other jurisdictions. And so when this item, goes before the Planning Commission, there will be public comment. The planning commissioners will have the ability to weigh in on sort of how to clearly define these metrics. And I think you bring up a good point. And then likewise, when this goes for a second reading to the board will have the ability to more clearly define these metrics and or modify this section as they see fit.
So, but to the extent, could you, like, if this is what we had signed off on, would you be able to say, oh yeah, this is what this means to me and this is how it would be implemented? Is it that clear? Because I know, just for people's benefit while you're considering that, when the team was working on this, we were of course looking at what we had, we were looking at what consultants gave us, and we were looking at what other jurisdictions had done. And so we tried to pull in language that we thought was hopefully representing best practices. But this is a good example of, but we have to be really clear about what it means. Just like, what does it mean of who gets to vote for a property? And what does it mean when we say these things about social inequity and so forth.
And you know, to the topic of adverse social equity outcomes, I think you raise a good point, which is how do we quantify that? You know, we could certainly work to more clearly define some of these concepts and you know, terms in the definition section related to, you know, some of Steve's comments as far as property owners, how many votes do they get? How does that work? And then we can certainly look into how to more clearly define and lay out a methodology to quantify, you know, adverse social equity outcomes.
Okay, so yes, here, there, and then we gotta wrap up.
I agree with potentially revets getting a fee waiver, but my question is, during the making of the new general plan, that's not gonna, like, if in part of the process of making the new general plan, our neighborhood is currently unclassified with the designation. So if our community decides to seek a certain zoning for our community at that time, that's not going to cost us anything, correct?
Oh, yeah, okay, so the question is if something about zoning comes out of the general planning process and a community plan within the general planning process, would there be some separate fee for that? No, I mean, the zoning that comes out of the general plan is paid for by the 2 point something million that we're already paying for that. And if it's a general plan component, that cost is covered. Okay.
So going forward, we were talking about opt-in and opt-out. So if will there be guidelines that if somebody elects to opt in, let's just say Lewiston, which is opt-out, they can submit an application to opt in, correct? And if they do, will there be guidelines as to what the requirements are going to be that the people that are, since it is an opt-out already, will there be guidelines as to what that person's going to have to meet the criteria or whatever? How does that work?
The criteria would be the same. You would have to have 50% of the property area and 60% of the landowners sign off on it before you could move forward.
Yeah.
Yes.
So just the exact same way. So if whatever criteria we end up with, if it's 50% of the land and 60% of the signatures and legal boundaries and all these other sorts of things, it would have to be exactly the same way. Is this a clarification on that?
So what if one person has a big parcel of land and he decides he wants to opt in, so he can vote, he'll get 100% because it's just him, and he owns all of that parcel. So how are you going to make that work?
I think you could all hear, and we have had that conversation. We don't have it worked out in the agreement, but we didn't want it to be one or two or whatever parcels. That's the whole point, is to, like Tom was saying, not have such a small area being carved in and out and all those other sorts of things. So I think that's a very good point. And we have talked about, is it minimum number of parcels or all kinds of things. So there's clearly more work to be done.
And if I may just kind of add a comment,
Last
that's definitely something that has come up in discussion. And one of the reasons that the language and this concept is based in sort of, that they have clearly defined legal boundaries is that in most other jurisdictions, there are, for example, for some city, right, there's every single part of that city is going to be in a particular fire district, let's say, or a particular municipal services district of some sort, which we don't really have in Trinity County. But that's a way that creating exclusionary zones doesn't allow for NIMBYism. And, we can go into that more, or we can save that for later. But that's one of the reasons why the language is posed in the way that it is, but it does need some more clarification in terms of opt-in, opt-out, how many parcels.
Okay. And this is going to be the last one, and we're going to move on.
I just think as an additional point, like Steve was saying, defining, how that's going to work with 50%, who's getting the votes and everything. You also have to take in consideration, if you don't get responses from the property owners, how are those being treated? And I think that needs to be clear in this algorithm as well.
Okay, good point. Yeah, I know. And I'm somewhat familiar from when we went through the process before. It was, are you counting the percentage of the positive that you received, and what happens, what do you count about the ones that you didn't hear back from, and all those sorts of things. And rather that being vague, which it is right now, it needs to be very, very clear. So, okay, I know we could go on forever, but I do want to acknowledge we just spent over an hour talking about opt-outs in Trinity County. And I'm not saying there wasn't emotion in the room, but this was a very controlled, focused discussion, and everybody got to be heard. So thank you very much for making that happen. Okay. Again, I know we could spend the rest of the night on this, but we're going to move to number 2, appeal criteria. You want to tee that one up? No, I had to call it off on the last one. 17. Okay.
So we're going to pull up that slide, which is on 17.
Oh, and while we're pulling this up, just so everybody knows, on the Cannabis Division website, we have the recordings of all these sessions, including this one will be up there probably sometime tomorrow, I would hope. We have the actual document. We have this presentation material. We have the email address, and seems like we had something else that I'm not thinking of. But all we're trying to make all that information is right on that main page of the Cannabis Division so that you can access it all very easily. Drew, it's all yours.
So here you guys can see the slide, and essentially I think the main section to point out is bullet number B2 essentially. Appellant must provide clear reasons for appeal that are supported by substantial evidence. One of the things I think that is sort of pushed us in that direction is that currently, without established appeal criteria, we could have someone appeal a project, the reason being, I don't like my neighbor. And so right now it's $500 to appeal, and that covers the planning commissioner's time. And so from a financial oversight perspective and financial management of the Cannabis Division, right now, the dynamic that we're in is that we will expend thousands of dollars of staff time to prepare staff reports and take them to the planning commission. And so it would just be helpful generally to have more clear criteria established for those appeals.
Drew, is there anything about what you have already tried to document in here about criteria that you think would be helpful, just to make sure people have a strong starting point for their discussion?
Yeah, so let me pull it up. But in the definition section, we've included a definition for substantial evidence, and that's taken from existing CEQA law, and that just gives us, some criteria and some framework as to how to qualify appeals.
And just to start it off, so clearly the I don't like my neighbor would not fit that criteria. Do you have another example or two of one that would and one that wouldn't? Let's say I hear people say about lights being on when they're not supposed to be on in the evening.
Sure. So lights being on with photos of lights being on I would consider that to be substantiated.
Okay.
Versus the neighbor kicked my dog, and I don't like them.
Which is one I actually had to spend time on and research and spend government dollars to go investigate. And it's just not in our jurisdiction. So we need to figure out a process for that. So 60% of my time every year is not spent, or the planner's time is not spent just on appeals.
Okay.
To qualify the photo thing with metadata.
Oh.
We've got photos that don't have any timestamp or date stamp, or we can't substantiate them.
So if you were hearing my example of the photo, most of cameras these days have metadata automatically in it. Where were you? What's the GPS coordinates? What's the time? What's the date? What's all that kind of stuff? And even though somebody really sophisticated can fake all that, if that stuff is there, that would be helpful of substantiation.
Right. And, most modern cell phones, when you take a picture, it has that metadata versus, if you were taking a picture with an old 35mm camera, it wouldn't have that information.
Doing the black and white conversion in your, black. Okay, I must start right here. And then I see Crystal and back here, and then Tom.
Could there be a different fee schedule for a director use permit as opposed to a CPU? Reason being is the director can easily say, yep, I want the license, and the appeal comes through. He says, no appeal. And then, as it has happened in the past, mitigate all of those appeal complaints, and then the commission has no power whatsoever.
Okay.
So a different fee schedule, or if the commission did a CPU, required a CPU, then I could see $500. If it's one unelected official or their staff, then it shouldn't be anything.
Okay, so the feedback is, first of all, should there be different for director's use permit type appeals or conditional use permit type appeals? And then an opinion of what should or shouldn't be included. So go ahead, Drew.
So generally, as far as fees, we're trying to move in the direction of cost recovery. Understanding that, you know, clearly a $500 appeal fee doesn't even begin in most cases to cover staff time, to develop a staff report, present it to the planning commission, take it to the board if it's appealed to the board, et cetera. To your question, Dave, essentially, currently, under the appeals code section, people are able to appeal any director's decision to the planning commission. And so there is no distinction currently between appealing a small license, a DUP, or a CUP, or any other director's decision from any other county division or department for that matter. So currently it's a $500 appeal fee, and that covers the planning commissioner's time.
Okay.
So before it even gets to the planning commission, does the cannabis director or does somebody there have the authority to deny an appeal so that it doesn't have to go that long travel and get to the planning commission and take up their time also?
If I'm understanding your question, I believe that that's the primary reason for establishing criteria for these appeals.
So, but today the answer is no.
Right.
Today, if it's filed, then it has to be processed, has to go all the way through. This criteria would say, well, it doesn't meet this criteria for the appeal process.
You all to deny it.
Yeah, to not take it in at all.
Okay, and then, I'm sorry, okay. I see your hand.
Okay, so just a few, well, the form does have a spot for denial, so whether it's approved or denied, so I'm not sure why that can't be used, but I have my issues with this is that it conflicts with 1734-110A, which defines in chapter 17, the appeals. Now you're going to take this new appeal and bring it into the cannabis only area and have different criteria, the criteria that you're using for appeals for cannabis related than planning related, because the planning one can also have, you know, the kick the dog. And I understand you're probably getting more of that under cannabis, but I think there's some inconsistencies there.
Just let's pause. So are you guys getting that are we referring to, there's a general planning appeal process that has definitions and criteria and process and all that kind of stuff. And then there's what we're trying to create here and the concern that those are going to be in conflict. Is that okay?
I think I follow the question. The way that I see it is that essentially we're not denying the appeal. We're basically saying that it does not meet the proposed criteria.
Well, which
And the word
denies it, right?
No, the approval or denial of the appeal under the current appeals code section is done by the planning commission.
Okay,
Correct.
so it's truly just saying because it doesn't meet the criteria, there is nothing to put forward to be approved or denied. So it just stops it in its tracks. Is that fair?
I'm also guessing that maybe, Crystal, the deny form that you're referencing on the form, like saying deny is when the case is when like a license is denied, like what was the decision type? Was it denied or was it approved? And then what you're appealing and the reasons for appeal.
I definitely misunderstood that. So I guess then my other concern here is that it needs to be very clear, concise, and so do all the regulations in a manner in which a general public person understands what they're reading and knowing what it is that they can or cannot appeal according to code. So it has to be very clear to the general public.
So just to clarify,
Subjective in the process of, well, who's really going to make that decision, whether it's viable or not?
So have as much clarity as possible so that it shouldn't be a surprise. We could easily point out this is where, and three other people would agree to that. So.
and just, just to clarify, it doesn't change what can be appealed. It changes the criteria by which we determine whether the appeal is substantiated or has substantial evidence to support it. So the director's decision can still be appealed the same as it always has been. It's just establishing criteria for which appeals are substantiated.
Okay, so I have Tom, Veronica, Tyler, and Rhoda, and volunteer. You have a follow-up?
Okay, well, and just then on the cost recovery form, is that going to be clear in the sense that I take it that if the appeal ultimately gets denied by the planning commission, you're going to go back to the appellant and say you have to pay additional costs? Is that what that is? And if that is the case, where does the appellant benefit if you come back and the planning commission has approved the appeal?
Are you, I'm not sure I understand your question.
I think this is going towards if,
Gross idea if you win.
oh, go ahead, Dan.
The way I understand that is we've heard that when Keith Groves was supervisor, we heard that several times where if you, as an appellant, if you win, then possibly not have to pay because apparently the county would be in error if you win an appeal. So you, am I getting that right? Where you would like to? Yeah.
Well, the cost recovery is really just about getting more clear about what are the actual costs of an appeal. Because right now, the $500 is theoretically covering the planning commission and none of staff. And so we have thousands of dollars that are not being covered by an appeal. And then there's a separate question that says, well, if I am the appellant and I win, if it's determined that quote, I was right, then should I have had to have paid to be proved that I'm right? Or should the county do that because the county was, in that example, quote, wrong?
Including submission of a cost recovery form. So we have to fill out a cost recovery form.
Can you explain that?
So I guess that's where I'm confused. What is that form and what is the purpose of it?
Your point is well taken, Crystal, and I think, it references what Dan mentioned about the sort of previous concept. Essentially, if the appeal is upheld, then the concept that I think we're talking about would be the appellant would not be required to pay any additional costs. If the appeal is denied, then the appellant is going to acknowledge in the cost recovery form that they will be billed at cost for staff time to process the appeal.
Okay, so it's basically a document signing. I agree, I will pay this cost of processing this.
Well, that needs to be further discussed.
Well, set the stage for that so we don't lose.
Well, because you're encouraging and you're getting into a position where maybe people will not appeal something they feel substantially viable based on the fact that maybe it might cost me another $2,000 if the planning commission comes back and says, no, you just misread that, or whatever the case is. So that's really a very touchy thing. And then going back to my original statement then is if it's upheld and the applicant has encountered numerous costs, license or, attorney fees beyond the appeal fee, is the county going to reimburse the applicant for those if their appeal is upheld?
Okay, so I have up there on the chart, and I'm sure you guys are taking notes, who pays for appeal? If approved, do they not pay? But this whole subject, we need to be very clear about. And then there's opinions.
On the subject of appeal, I was wondering if we could potentially bifurcate the types of appeals, which is say split them in half. Some appeals will be as regards the director's decision. And I'm just talking about cultivation licenses now. He didn't take into consideration that this was in a carve out, or this should have had a variance required and it didn't, or something that is a alleged failure of staff to do something that the ordinance requires, versus something that is CEQA driven, saying, oh, actually, this operation impacts spotted owls that happen to be here, or there's something which certainly has that substantial evidence criteria. And when we're talking about CEQA, we're talking about what we call the record of decision. And, you know, I defend a lot of these appeals. So mistakes in the appeal process tend to benefit me. However, in the interest of fairness, when the county comes in with a notice of decision that says this license has met the Appendix C and fits under our programmatic EIR, what they are putting on the scales of justice is these 2,000 pages of the programmatic EIR plus the Appendix C plus staff time. So on the other side of the scale must be something, not that this guy's a pain, he's loud. It's got to be something. I have well reports from 2008 until 2022, and I always had this water. They started this operation. Now my well is down to here. Something, evidence. And I think we've seen this come up in a couple of these hearings. We have to remember that philosophically, the purpose of compliance and the appeals and everything is to bring these operations into compliance, not to say you can't do it. Begrudgingly, we've come up with the rules. So what we're trying to do is make the people adhere to the rules. And the other thing, if I could beg for a procedure beyond submitting, going to the planning commission, like staff, I think we backtrack from staff report, say the staff report will be ready 10 days before the meeting. Appellant 3 days later has to put in their statement. Appellee puts in a statement 2 days after that. Appellant gets the last word. Everybody gets public comment, but when you get lawyers on both sides and we're like trying to ambush each other, it just makes it hard for the commission, especially, and staff, to have to react to this if they're going to get it like an hour before.
So what you were describing is what you would like to see of a timeline of required deadlines for things.
And whatever you come up with, as long as it's the rules, are great, but there should be some timeline.
Bifurcation is like ordinance side versus CEQA side.
I would. And I think, you know, for people who have problems with their neighbors, one way to shore up the appeal is make these complaints as they come in, so that then your appeal has a complaint history. Look, 3 times over the last year, I reported light leakage.
And Tom, I don't know if this fit at all, but I was almost hearing a little bit of you saying an error versus a finding, because I heard you say, well, you know, when staff approved, they didn't realize that they should have required this, versus there's a finding that my well has dropped by 50% since such and such. Is that fair, or is it better to use the CEQA versus?
That's how I see it falling under, like, the director's error would be what you're appealing for. Oh, she lied on her application and really doesn't have a well. She has a truck that pumps water into her water, something like that.
Okay.
Versus a finding. You said there's no historical resources there, but I know my great grandfather built a cabin and they wanted to dig it up to build their drawing.
Okay. So I have in this, just since you guys can't see my notes, I have an error versus a finding, evidence versus a motion. And then I have this separate concept of a clear timeline for evidence being produced so that we have a more structured approach that is easier for us to manage. And I think at some point, we probably ought to also be looking at, at what point do we have a way where you're asking for something to be revisited and it's really just about coming back to the department? Because in the example of, oh, well, yeah, they forgot to check a box required. Well, that shouldn't have to go all the way to a planning commission to say, yes, you were right. They should have, we should be able to say, oh, yep, you're right. We'll do this and it's done and so forth. And
I would like to
maybe
point
we
out
already
we've
have
done
that.
that.
Oh, we already have that?
Yes.
Okay.
We,
thank
we've
you.
done that this year and corrected things as they came up.
Okay. So I think I had Veronica, Tyler here. Oh, no, here, and then there.
I want to jump back to what Crystal was saying and go back to Director Plabani. What I think she means, and I would support, is having clear explanations or clear examples of what would be considered substantive evidence. It's not the process itself that we don't want you to be chasing and spending thousands of our tax dollars chasing dog bites. However, figure out a way to put the license fee in that would be great. Help the animal shelter. But I've seen at several meetings, people come in with photos, and maybe if they knew it needed to have the metadata or whatever specific things, because it can get pretty subjective, I do believe, when it hits your desk sometimes. And it's human nature. You look at things one way, we look at things another way, and they could still be facts. They can still be facts. Just how you interpret those facts, I think, is what could become the issue. So perhaps a little more quantitative or substantial idea to the general public that we can understand, not leaving things out and knowing that they have to go to the state and do other things. Be very clear with the general public who don't eat and breathe this every day.
I think this is a good example where certainly within the ordinance, we need to be as clear as possible. But that's also perhaps an area where FAQs could come in handy, where we can say, here's an example, what happens when it's this? And we say, well, here's how it happens. And
Sure, or policy memos or. Yep,
yes,
definitely.
Well, policy memos work better for us, but FAQs are
Fair, okay.
To Veronica's point, is like when you don't live in this world. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, so I think I'm finally here.
I guess prior to the discussion that you brought up of the fees, I was going to suggest that. I mean, there's other examples of this within our court system and so forth of having fee-based recovery for appeals. And although I think it's like a crucial part of our democracy to allow for appeal and so forth, it's all of our money, right? It's not like when we talk about suing the county or their money, it's like, it's our money, right? Like I like to see the library funded as opposed to staff time or money spent on frivolous appeals, whether it's for cannabis or something else. So I just don't understand if you were to bring a completed packet of photos, evidence, all that stuff, the cost recovery would be next to nothing because there would be no staff time required. It would be present to the planning commission. Here's the evidence that we found. The $500 would more or less cover it. So I just would almost encourage to have that cost recovery just to prevent, I mean, not just for cannabis, but to prevent, emotion-driven appeals and have it be evidence-based. Because if there's clear evidence that was presented, it should wrap itself up quickly. And then just to look at other examples outside of cannabis for license denial. Like I'm in construction, there's really clear criteria that's strictly evidence-based for denying stuff. So to try and take the emotion out of it as much as possible.
Thanks, Tyler.
Not me, I've already done.
Oh, sorry.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm glad we're going to go to, or perhaps we're going to get to inspections and enforcement because they're actually connected. And the appeal criteria, of course, people want substantial evidence, but the onus is on the appellant. So yeah, when you have photos, we're taking them with metadata. It would be nice, which we do, but it'd be nice to be able to call someone from the county. And this would build a background of substantiated evidence. And yeah, actually being loud is one of the ordinances. So when you have 8 industrial fans, there's someone in the county who's been trained in audiology and can come up and measure it. Insofar as the resources can be supplied by the county, it's not pushed on the applicant who's already paying for those third party. And recently we went through a process where the board misunderstood excavation question and required us going to a third party and a different department to get clarity. So we like to talk about substantial as if it's self-evident. And I'm worried that this moves the process to an administrative decision outside of public purview, because as complicated as getting to a public hearing is, it is still public. And honestly, we have had immense difficulty using PRAs to get reports that we know exist that were made at different points. We can't even get the reports. We can't even get the county's photos. So when I see a process being moved from the public to an administrative decision on what's substantial or what's accurate or what's true, a little flag goes up. The language sounds good, but I feel like the process, which should also include a phone number or a person at the county who can do the substantiation, that would give everyone an equal playing field. Have a person who knows how to measure audio come up and do it. And then we all live by that decision. That we actually have to pay someone from Reading to come out to do it. And you want us to now pay if the decision doesn't go our way? I feel like we get to the place where it gets turned around. You should pay for that audiologist. You should pay for the flora and fauna survey we paid. You know, I mean, there's a lot of expenses, including legal, right? Which is building towards a court case, which can stand and hold water. This is extremely expensive. We're not talking $500.
That's for sure. So what I put here is, I put transparency is key because I heard you mentioning that, so that in some fashion, if we're doing some of these things more administratively, that we still have some level of transparency so that people have that goes with the clarity that we had already captured that needs to be in place for those. And I think that was it. Okay, so I'm coming back here. I think I have Rhoda, then Steve, then Dave.
Of course, I agree with Tom. These unforeseen consequences is a big reason that I think the appeals process should exist. Oh, my well got pumped dry and I didn't expect that to happen. But also, I feel like, and I'm sure that staff probably has a much better knowledge of this than I do, but I feel like the appeals process is working to an extent in that, you know, there have been some appeals that have gone to the planning commission. And when staff gets there, they're like, well, when we looked at the appeal, we went through the file and we did find out there was a problem. So we rescinded their license. I think they returned the appellant's fee. So it seems to me like if what you're saying is an actual fact, it doesn't seem to be costing the appellant any money, and the license has been rescinded on more than one occasion. So it seems like the appeals process is functioning very, very well. Also, I would like to make sure we talk about an appeals process for violations, that there should be a process to appeal when somebody has written a violation to a farm. There currently is no appeals process for that.
Anything more on that? 'Cause I'll capture that. No, that's it. Just yeah. Okay, so have you got that about? So you're talking about if the division writes a violation, and what is the process for the operator to appeal that? Yeah. Right. That and is there anything in this that covers that?
To my knowledge, no, there's nothing that covers the appeal of a violation, although I have heard that there is some existing mechanism to do that, but I don't know offhand how it's done. So, okay.
Okay, captured. And I have to go back here first.
Yeah, boy, there's a bunch here. One, just a comment that it seems again and again, we keep leaning, you know, it always leans away from the farmer in these. If there's a choice to be made, it seems like it's always just leaning away. You know, to this gentleman's comment earlier, in all other building and planning aspects, you don't get the county to come pay for your, environmental survey because somebody built a building or a subdivision next door. The county doesn't come pay for you to survey if that's affecting your bird migration patterns. So I don't see why we would do that differently for cannabis in Trinity County, and expect the county to expend enormous resources every time there's a complaint that now we need to send, one of our limited staff members out with a, audio meter or whatever else to measure. Certainly that doesn't happen that I've ever been aware of in any other, building and planning industry. Is there any provision in the appeal process that prevents, somebody in Hettenshaw from appealing my license? Is that part of the substantial evidence? Is there any relation to, is just anybody allowed to appeal? Or does it have to be somebody who's actually, within my vicinity?
So right now, there is no criteria for that. So that was something that we wanted to try to address with these updates, which is on page 21. That section, the B1 says appellant must live, work, or formally be associated with a land use type specified in table 2 of the subject location they are appealing. So it relates back to the buffer table.
Okay, I got hung up on the land use type.
We can try to make that more clear.
Okay. Thank you. Oh, and I think the state does have a process for appealing state violations. So if we're looking at, maybe there's some language there that could be copy and pasted.
Okay, who have I forgotten that had their hand up?
If I go up for a judge and he finds me guilty and I appeal, do I go up with the same judge again? Because that's what we're asking Drew to do right now, is his decision. I appeal, it's his decision again. Now that goes for both directions. It doesn't go to the commission. If I appeal your decision, and you determine that my appeal doesn't have any validity, it's your opinion. It's still the same judge.
I follow your concern, but just.
He has a decision and I'm appealing it. I don't need to go to him. I need to go to the next one up, just like any other appeals process.
And that's why we've tried to establish clear criteria so that it's not a discretionary decision.
So and I think what I'm hearing is that perhaps there is some, there's like an escalation process, if you will. If you come back to the cannabis division and they think it doesn't meet the criteria, but you think you can still make a case that it does, then that goes up to the CAO before it's just kicked out or something like that.
I think the feedback.
Go ahead.
I think the feedback that we're hearing is that it needs to be very clear on the criteria, and it can't be something in itself that's discretionary. Like what, if we used a definition, it needs to be clearly defined and very evident, and it can't be something that someone else has a decision on.
Drew determining I didn't find smell as a problem, but the commission that I'm trying to appeal his decision, the commission would say, yeah, that smells a problem. But if I keep going back to the same judge, it's going to keep coming back with the same answer.
Okay, so I have captured, take out discretion and question mark about an escalation process. That there's something in between the division and the planning commission. Well, I'm just giving you another step before you go through a whole other process, but not to keep it from going to the planning commission, but to give another step.
In the FEIR, smell is addressed.
Okay. All right.
And I can just give some feedback to Dave's comments, which essentially one of the things that's come out of the other meetings is that the other option, instead of it going, essentially, if we were to establish criteria, then it would move up the chain of command to now the director or deputy director of community development department. So it would go over my head to the next person. And then at that point, they would be able to make a decision, if that's what you're proposing, or, it just goes straight to PC. But maybe we want to poll the crowd and see if they want to have criteria for appeals, or they want to see just any appeal whatsoever for no basis.
So
The criteria would be codified, and that's kind of what we're trying to work
Yeah.
through, is how to establish clear criteria.
So just to Drew's point, is there anyone here that want to raise their hand and say they don't think we should be establishing criteria for whether an appeal should be officially considered? Okay, all right. No, I didn't think so, but he asked the question, so I wanted to go there. Okay, so I think we have a clear message. We do want the clarity there. What I'm hearing is there's concern that however clear we make it, there's still going to be some discretionary aspect to that. And should there be some way of escalating if they disagree with, because I get the point of, well, Rick made the decision, then we had to come back to Rick and he goes, well, of course I made the right decision. And then that's it. And so what is our way of going past that? Okay, so now we're at 8. No, it's a process. We're talking process. It's 8:12. We're on subject number 2. Do you want to move on? Raise your hand if you want to move on. Raise your hand if you want to stay on this subject. I've only got a couple hands. We're gonna have to move on. Sorry. Again, we'll take some more feedback. Number 3 is enforcement. Drew, you want to set the stage?
Sure, we'll try and pull up the appropriate slide.
Here, did you have something you want to say real quick on that subject while he's bringing up the slide?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that it looks to me like, the appellant has 10 days after the notice of decision to do an appeal and bring substantiated evidence, or whatever the word is. That evidence may not occur within that 10-day period. And so what's the point?
Did you follow that?
I would add that there was a comment previously before that if you're experiencing any code violation behavior, you should be documenting that as it's occurring so we can address it through the processes we already have in our program, and then documenting that as part of an appeal later on, if that's where this hypothetical situation is going.
The example being, if my complaint is about lights, I take a photo, it has a date, time, GPS location, and so I have, when I request.
So I can't appeal. It doesn't make any sense to appeal the decision to grant someone a permit. There's no real way to appeal that.
Oh, okay. Do you understand? So he's saying, I'm not appealing because they're not doing what they're supposed to be doing. I'm appealing they shouldn't have been issued it in the first place. And what's the evidence I would bring to say that they shouldn't have been issued in the first place?
That's up to the appellant.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure I fully follow, but one thing I would just want to say for everyone's awareness, when it comes to concerns about cannabis cultivation not meeting code requirements, we do have an existing process where you can complain or submit a complaint form to the cannabis division, and staff will go out and verify those complaints to the best of our ability. And we are doing that presently. It's been, obviously everything is a work in progress, but I sent staff out today to verify a complaint that we received up in Coffee Creek. So we're definitely moving in that direction. And that is right now one of the best mechanisms that people can engage in to document their, experiencing of issues that they're having. And we will do our best to objectively document noise concerns, light concerns, things like that.
Okay. So the next subject was enforcement.
So we took the existing section, which I believe was called suspension and or revocation, and took some of the language that Mentor Harnish Rincon team provided to us and created this consolidated enforcement, suspension, denial, and revocation section, I think, and fees, and fines. So one of the things that we're working through is that, and one of the processes that we've established currently is that for violations or concerns of not meeting requirements related to another department or agency, we now have established a formal referral process. So if there are concerns about building code violations, those are referred to the building department. If there's concerns about people not meeting water board standards or CDFW standards, those are referred to the agency who oversees those regulations so that they can exercise their discretionary authority within the framework of their program to decide, okay, we've seen that it looks like this driveway isn't surfaced with 6 inches of crushed rock. Should that be a reason to suspend or revoke a license? The pathway that we've taken now is we do a formal referral to the water board or to CDFW and ask them, hey, this is, say, this is what we've documented. What does your agency believe is the appropriate course of action? Do you wish to pursue violations? Do you wish to have us halt our approval of a license or the project and really rely on their broad understanding of their regulatory program to figure out that balance? Related to the DCC, the DCC's process is a little different. So I've engaged in discussions over the last few months with DCC staff about essentially, what are their criteria for, I think they were previously doing notices of noncompliance or some other term. Now they're doing notices to correct. And so how do they see that framework of violations and how does it escalate from a notice to correct to suspension to revocation? And so that's something that we certainly need to continue to work with the other agencies to more clearly establish, what we as Trinity County can do, should do, and based on sort of their framework, if we're relying on their regulations.
I would do wish to add too, because what's lacking in our current ordinance that's been an issue is, revoking doesn't necessarily fix any problems, right? Because you need to sometimes in certain situations, and this is where enforcement gets sticky with the stick or the carrot situation, but you need to be able to suspend, which we don't have the current ability to do. So that way you're kind of in a sense dangling a carrot. So if you correct your actions, then you can keep moving forward. You can have your license back. You're back in compliance. But sometimes when you just revoke, the problem's still there. Maybe people walk away. So I just want to add that little extra part.
And I'm just going totally from a flawed memory, but I am recalling this conversation in some of the other meetings, and some of the things that have come up have been everything from, I think, Matt, it was you of saying, at least the way you interpret it was, if I jaywalk and get caught, I could lose my permit because of how loosely it seemed to be written from your standpoint. And so we were trying to be very clear about, program related offenses and how they should be dealt with. Another thing that came up was about, does there need to be this sort of tiered approach that one type of violation, if you will, is more important or significant than another one, and repeats of things should be addressed in a way that is dealt with in a more severe manner, if you will. So I think that's some of the feedback we've already received. And so let's take it from there. And I'm going to start with Matt, then Crystal, then. Okay.
Just on the one topic that you brought up that I had brought up last week about jaywalking and this or that, I think Dan said it very well, that we could just add the word cannabis. I don't want to misquote you, Dan. I shouldn't quote you. I'm not trying to do that. But there was something, I don't have this section in front of me, but it was like adding the word cannabis.
Yeah. Okay. All right. I can get you. Yeah.
So I would also go along with what was suggested in the other ones then about the tiered process, the minor, like the DCC. guidelines do, where they have the minor, moderate, and major, whatever the term, pardon me? Yeah. Types of fines. They have fees that are different for the type of violations as well. I think $100 a day is very, 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 very minimal for what we're dealing with here. And I think we need to reconsider what the amount of that fee is per day, depending on the type of violation that it is. And then also address what happens with the repeat offenders, that even though they comply each time, they're still out of compliance and have to be cited or whatever the case is, and be told to come back into compliance over and over and over again. So I agree with what the discussion was previously.
Okay.
I was just, I guess, hopeful that we could not burden the county too much with enforcement that's already done by other agencies. I know Drew discussed referring to other agencies, which I think is a great thing. I mean, I feel the redundancy of inspections. I know it's been mentioned of there's no oversight. There's no, there's nobody following up on these things. I had DCC twice and CDFW inspections last year at one location. So, I don't feel like the county having somebody come out for the same things is very beneficial to anybody in the room here. I think their time can be spent a lot better elsewhere. So to just have a little faith, a little patience, knowing that these other agencies, like there is enforcement happening, there is things going on with time that will shake itself out. And the county should hopefully focus on what its jurisdiction is, which is the land use based stuff, not on what, say, a DCC license already is looking at. There's no reason for the county to, I feel like, I shouldn't say double check, which they should maybe be doing, but to look at the same thing twice. There's already so much oversight within this industry. I mean, it's absurd. I mean, I know, being a general contractor, I mean, it is far easier to get a biannual renewed $350 general contractor's license than it is to grow 10,000 square feet of pot in your yard. I mean, it is so crazy to me that, we've gotten to this point, but with time, it will become more evident that the enforcement process is happening, and to just make it based on something else that is already some template. I use construction because I know it, but there's fees, there's residual consequences. I have very nice greenhouses that have automated computer controllers for the lights. They malfunction sometimes. I have seen it happen myself. I have had to go up there and fix it. So like, we're still people, there's still mechanics. Like, it's not always to just disregard the rules. So.
Thanks. And I actually heard an example given at one of the previous meetings of, do we treat a big windstorm came through and not only blew off the tarp, but it destroyed the tarp. And so you have to go get a new one. It takes time and so forth. Is that the same as I am intentionally not closing up every night and, kinds of things like that? Also, Drew, am I remembering there's something about, do we have MOUs with some of these other agencies where we are to go out on their behalf, or am I making that up in my head?
To my knowledge, the only MOU that the Cannabis Division has with another department is the Sheriff's Office.
Oh, okay. All right. Thanks. So here I know, Steve and Lisa, anybody else that I've missed?
I do second what Tyler was talking about. If there are other agencies that would be more appropriate. However, I would still like to suggest that you are our people. We don't know that you've kicked the can down the road. To continue to follow up, put it in the file, be able to give us answers rather than just, oh, we've given it to somebody else, and not worry about what the public is sitting there waiting to hear or find out about. I think that's an important thing to remember too, that even though you're passing it to another agency that would be more appropriate and take that workload off of you, I do still believe it would be your responsibility, because you're our people, to find out what that determination was, have it in the file, and then I put it in the writing, put it in writing.
But your point's well taken that, in terms of complaints through the complaint portal, that, there could be more clear follow-up and communication from the cannabis division saying, okay, we've received your complaint. We've gone out, county staff has gone out and done site inspections, and we've referred it to the appropriate agency.
We're not gonna tell you how it's.
Yep.
I did have that conversation last week, if that gives you any faith. And told them who to contact in the sheriff's department and.
Yes?
Yes.
Okay. Just a comment on the referral to other agencies. Well, I wanted Veronica to kind of hear this. Veronica, just a comment about the referral to other agencies. Typically, that's because the county doesn't have jurisdictional authority in that particular area to enforce the regulations of the other agencies. I totally agree that it should be part of kind of like a case management where you continue to follow up, make sure that that was resolved, but that's oftentimes why the referral is done.
Lisa,
Second-
can I jump in for 1 sec just to clarify that currently, if we receive a complaint and we refer it to another agency and that agency issues a violation under their authority, that prevents us from issuing the license until that violation has been cleared, unless that agency gives us written authorization to say, we're okay with it. They've shown us a plan, progress, et cetera, and the project can proceed. So that is kind of in place, but
Right.
we obviously need to convey that information to the concerned parties more effectively.
Yep. Second, I think that maybe the MOU, previously Joe Moreo, the Ag Commissioner, did do DCC inspections kind of early on. So maybe that might have created some confusion. I don't think that's in place anymore. And then finally, just has there been discussion about implementing fines along with enforcement? So depending on, first, second, third violation, additional revenue that could be driven into the cannabis department.
Speak to that.
It's certainly something that's come up many times in conversation between staff and at ad hoc meetings. And so that is something that it sounds like we want to clearly establish, a progressive fine structure and sort of how to, 3 strikes you're out or whatever sort of criteria can be established.
Increased penalty / fine, because it could be a penalty that's more operationally based, or it could be penalty that is fine based, or it could be both. But basically what I'm hearing is it increases as the offenses become repeat.
Just one more,
Okay, so-
one more thing. I heard someone mention $100 a day fine. That was previously for abatement, so not someone in this program, right? And now that's been increased to $1,000 a day. So just, there might be some confusion there. It's not part of our cannabis program.
I think
Actually, that $100 is put in this as kind of a placeholder right now, because that is our county code for violations of county code. So that undoubtedly will change. I would hope that it would be a more tiered approach, but we haven't got to that discussion yet.
And
Well, we have, but we haven't finalized.
this isn't exactly what I was going to say, but I'm just going to comment since the topic of fines is up there. I do think that's a good idea. It certainly helps establish this record. But acknowledging that, again, the end goal here is compliance. Obviously, if we need a carrot and a stick for that. So if we're going to have a numerical fine, and I think it's appropriate, I think we still need, just like in other ordinances for other zoning conditions, we still need that cure time, which I think is also written in there, that 7-day to come into compliance thing. But as enforcement, like a lot of people have been saying, yes, I, a complainant, can see something and then I call the department and want them to come out and hope that you see the same thing. The more documentation that the complainant can make on their own, not to say it's everybody's job to do enforcement, but it's about a record. Not only does it help staff to evaluate the situation and issue a notice of violation if appropriate, but it also helps focus be it an appeal or what the problem is. If the problem is really light leakage and it's coming in your window all the time when you're trying to sleep, that's a very different thing than, I don't like cannabis. I've never liked cannabis. It's bothered me the way hippies came here, whatever it is. You know, focusing on the particulars helps everybody, because it allows staff to evaluate what they need to act on. It allows the licensee to see what they're doing wrong. And it probably allows complainants to see if there's, you know, smaller conversations they can have. Maybe a fence, you know, solves a lot of these problems. Fences make great neighbors. And maybe it's not, oh, you can't do what you do over there. Or maybe it's a generator house instead of a generator, whatever it is. By making a record, it kind of helps everybody. I know it's a little bit more burdensome, but I think it's probably worth the effort, even if it's just notes accompanied by a picture. And like I said, everybody was saying, we've got the metadata on those pictures. So I'd encourage that to, you know, we're a small county, so we're all kind of got to look out for it too. So everybody's a little bit in enforcement.
And it's interesting, I even, being sensitive to sound and so forth, not about cannabis particularly, but I have a decibel rating app on my phone. So I can turn that on and it'll tell me how loud is the sound. And it was one of the things that made me start wearing earplugs when I was driving the tractor. Okay, so we are 8:32. The next item is inspections. Oh, no, I'm not passing on yet. I'm just saying. Next one is inspections about cannabis operations. So we're going to be ready to move on after these last two hands. Okay, so I've got these last two and we'll move on.
Seems like inspections kind of ties in with enforcement a little bit here as well. And, you know, like Tyler threw out some acronyms, and I believe there was a gentleman earlier here who was asking about, you know, inspections for hog farms. And there seems to be a common misconception that we're not inspected. I have permits and licenses from 8 different agencies. I get inspected by many of those. I've been inspected by the county every year. I've been inspected by the state several times. When people say DCC, that's the Department of Cannabis Control. That's your state license, because we actually have 7 or 8 different permits that we have to get, including a county permit, and there's a state permit. And the state does their own inspections, and they do site inspections, and then they also do metric inspections, which is your track and trace. They actually come in and verify that the material you have matches the database of the material that you've entered into the database. So the DCC actually has multiple different inspection teams that come around on a yearly basis. There's also the CDFW, which is the Department of Fish and Wildlife, who has tons of authority to come in and regulate the snot out of you. There's also the Water Board. The Water Board doesn't do inspections as much as I think it's complaint based. So if there's any misconceptions about cannabis farms getting inspected, the licensed cannabis farms have plenty of inspections. And there was also, not to disagree too much, but there was in the last meeting, somebody asked about how long do you have to be notified? Drew, you said 24 hours, and I think that's a misconception, because technically the county, we sign a notice of, what was the right to enter property. So they're allowed to enter our property at any time. I think it's a courtesy from the county to give us 24-hour notice, theoretically, so we can be there to go through our site plan and stuff with them. But the county has the right. We sign a paper every single year that says the property owner has to sign it. That says you can enter my property at any time you want for inspections. We have another one with the state that says the same thing. The state has the right to enter my property at any time. I've given up all these rights so I can grow my 1/4 acre of cannabis in my backyard. So I just want to clear up any misconceptions anybody has about us not getting inspected. We got microscopes up our keisters all year long. It never stops. So, and then I hope that there's and it seems like there probably will be, but maybe we can put it in the language that there's some kind of severity of violation. Like there's like, we've mentioned it a couple times. I just hope that there's some actual language that's, dumping fertilizers in the creek. Good Lord, that would bring all the agencies out. In case you're wondering, it's not just county, it's everybody if that happens. Versus, it was a windy night and my tarp blew up and somebody saw some light peeking out. And then my final question here is, if the county is notifying other agencies of a potential violation, is it appropriate and can we make sure that the licensee is notified that this has happened? Is that appropriate and can we make sure that it's in the language that it happens? Thank you.
So I guess the first question is, do we notify the other agencies when we're I guess if it's one of their, if it's supposed to be one of the state's violations, we would notify the state. Is that what you're getting at? That's
They notify CDFW. Will they notify me as well? If they notify state, will they notify me as well? Or is it all secret and I don't know that they've been?
So you got the question?
Yeah.
You got an answer?
Yeah.
Okay.
Currently, with the formal referral process as it's established, we are notifying the applicant at the same time along with the applicable agency.
Yeah, when you do notify a different agency and they find that there is a violation, then the county doesn't get to collect the fine that you would have if you inspected. Point one. Point two, I just have a question. We have a budget. You just went through the budget. There's over 500,000 of fines not collected. You're talking about going to a collection agency to do it, just to recover some of it. What can we do to force them to pay the fines or revoke the license? I mean, how many fines do you have on the books before you act?
Okay. And you guys might have this information about the fines, about whether, what percentage of that has been on legal operations versus, permitted operations versus not permitted operations. But for reference, my recollection is we have issued approximately $6 million worth of fines. Some of those are when I think we're at $10,000 a day. And we've got about 2.5 to 3 million that are still out there that potentially could be collected. And we put out an RFP to find a collections agency to help us try to go get that money because it's just been sitting there. And so it was simply a way of trying to recapture some of those funds. Is there anything else you want to comment on?
Yeah, I just want to kind of clarify that your point is well taken, Dave. That's the reason that we've included this additional fine language into this enforcement section, because previously the cannabis division didn't have a clear mechanism to issue fines in-house directly to program participants. And then related to the larger sort of, the numbers that came through in the budget hearings, my understanding is that the majority of those fines were to non-program participants. And those were historical fines collected over the last 5 years or so that are still outstanding. So, but yes, definitely that is one of the primary reasons that we've included fines in the enforcement section so that we can levy fines against program participants who are non-compliant directly and not have to pass it to code enforcement, which then incurs an additional cost for their staff to issue the fine and reduces the actual revenue to county coffers as a result of their non-compliant activity.
Just a further comment on that as well, what Rick mentioned about the fines that are outstanding, those aren't related to our program. So our program is funded by fees that the farmers pay. We don't have access to that money now. It's under 17.42, which is through the sheriff's office for their code enforcement. So it would be wonderful because we do pay $500,000 in this year's budget that the farmers have to borrow to pay for that because the deficit in our budget, if we could recoup some of that cost because the farmers are bearing that cost of that code enforcement, but none of those fines are coming into the program to fund the program. So that's all general fund and it's really unrelated to 17.43.
And I don't think that even if we issue fines directly from the cannabis division to program participants. And I don't know the code section off the top of my head, but I believe that any fine still would go into general fund as discretionary general fund dollars and wouldn't come directly to the cannabis division regardless.
I don't know that answer, but I know it has come up about whether some of that money come back in. Even an example given of if you're collecting fines that are funded by the code enforcement, which is funded by the cannabis division, do you at least reimburse the cannabis division / cultivators for the cost that, yeah, all that. Okay, so we are 20 minutes left. These nights go so fast. Inspections, it was our subject, and we actually touched on that a little bit a minute ago. Is there other things that you wanted to talk about with inspections or questions before we wrap up that? No? Okay.
I could provide a little bit
Go ahead.
more context to that, just to clarify. You know, Steve made a great comment about all of the agencies that, you know, people that are currently cultivating in Trinity County have to get approval from in some capacity. But essentially, previously, post TAA lawsuit, there was a requirement for a pre-licensure inspection. Then moving forward into post CEQA approval and licensure with an approved CEQA document, there is a requirement for the mitigation monitoring and reporting program and inspections of those mitigation measures. So going forward, we will basically continue to have what we've set in place now, which is two layers of inspection. One is essentially pre-licensure code compliance based, and then it's going to be an ongoing environmental compliance based inspection to ensure that program participants are complying with the mitigation measures that have been deemed applicable to their project. And then there will also be an additional layer in terms of the annual renewal process that they will need to upload, or we're working through the technical details, but essentially submit annual reporting similar to what they have to do for water board annual reporting to show staff that they've made progress or have accomplished the various mitigation measures going forward.
Drew, can you just provide people a frame of reference? So we're talking about we need to receive and review applications and all of the things that go with them, and especially in this cycle where we're going through all the initial sequences and so forth. There's a lot of that. There's inspections to get approved and then inspections to continue operations. There are visits to go check on complaints that come in. I'm probably missing a whole bunch of other things.
No, I think
you have a staff of what size?
We have 9 staff in total.
For a total right now of combined existing permits issued and applications in hand.
Roughly 426. Vidette does the weekly numbers. She might know them better off the top of her head.
Okay. So, and it is a thing where, it's like, there's a lot of work on these folks' hands. And one of the things, am I right? Did we get the funding for you guys to get a new platform that allows you to be more in sync with DCC and all that kind of stuff that actually brings you into at least this century?
The last communication that I got was that the Office of Grants Management is exceptionally busy and they will get back to me on our pending budget modification request.
Okay. So we are trying to, there are some platforms out there that are used by various jurisdictions and so forth that tie in from records keeping processes, sales, the metrics that was referred to by Tyler and so forth. So we're trying to get into those platforms so that the team is not having to do everything so manually.
And what I can say is that, yes, we've definitely been, the DCC and many other jurisdictions currently use the Acela software platform. And so we've definitely been engaged with Acela to try it. We've got a quote from them for implementation and ongoing use of their software. And it actually integrates with the DCC system so that there would be automated communication between the county and the DCC as it relates to violations or any sort of non-compliance. And it's just automatically, communicates through API. So that is what we're working towards. Funding remains to be seen.
Okay. But not only a streamlining for the purposes of the team, but also makes it a lot easier for them to answer our questions and track, as we've been, saying is important to us. So I know the board was very much in support of getting you the tools that you need to be successful. Okay, so we have 15 minutes left. Our next item, I think most of the people that raised their hand about this one have left, but it was the similar use zoning DUP versus CUP allowed by right. So do you want to tee us up, Drew? I think while they're looking, I'll point to Dana, but I think Dana was one of the folks that at one point when I was first trying to kind of get my head around all of this, the cannabis division was trying to catch up with where everything that was in hand. And so we had to hire a bunch of folks to come in and literally go through huge manual paper files just to figure out what we were starting with. And we're not much, we've gone through all that now, but we're still in that much of a manual mode. So it will be a huge improvement when we get some automation and streamlining. Okay, Drew.
So I can do my best to give maybe some more context or guide the questions so that we can answer them. I'm not really sure sort of as far as the bulk of what we put together there for the question. Essentially, this slide is talking through in some ways the parallel between cannabis cultivation at this scale and like a home business is kind of what we're one of the things we're trying to capture in terms of, the uses that are allowed by right, and then the uses that require a director's use permit or a conditional use permit, and pretty much all of the home occupancy businesses and use types, I guess, that are codified currently in Trinity County Code require either a DUP or a CUP. So that's part of, I think, what was being asked. I don't know if maybe folks who had that question want to clarify, and then we can dive into it if Bella wants to.
Yeah, I can add a little bit more. So part of the review of the ordinances is that I went through every single type and I went through every single zone and I compared the different activity types to the current. Oh, it's fine. I got it down here. To the cannabis types of the other similar uses, right? So when we went through that, I'll add a little bit before the difference, so that it's not really by right, because Dan and I were discussing that briefly. This isn't like, so if you're in R1, you can build a single family home by right. You don't have to ask anybody to do it. You have to get a building permit. Yes. But in this scenario, you also need to get a license. So there's also a discretionary review that comes in that's different than other activities and situations where it is allowed by right. So that it just gets a little confusing there. But then elevating from that, we've got our director's use permit, and director's use permits are usually activities that have a slightly higher controversy or slightly higher situations where maybe more environmental review needs to come in or something like that. And then that will follow the same process really that a CUP would follow, that just that the planning commission would decide for a conditional use permit, which is assumed to have even higher public controversy to allow for a public hearing. And then, both decisions are allowed to be appealed. Everything is always subjected to public file review. And both in situations have to be subject to CEQA, whether that's an exemption or through ISM&D or an Appendix C tearing off of our programmatic document. And as I was saying before, I went through all those different activities really as a result of what came out of the storefront ordinance and how that was implemented. Because in that situation, that ordinance that was adopted added an additional discretionary permit, a director's use permit for storefront retail in zones that allowed retail by right. So so thrift stores and other stuff like that is allowed in C2, but we added another layer of review. And I just was trying to offer an equal playing field for these activities. So of course, it's open to public review. The planning commission can decide something else. The board can decide something else. But as a result of the review, nursery distribution was changed from a CUP to a DUP. And an environmental review is still going to have to occur, and it's going to be at cost. And that's why I feel a little bit more comfortable with that. And then I also established clearer thresholds between a CUP and a DUP, which is kind of what Drew was speaking at with home occupation compared to, because there's minor use and there's major use for those various activities in the home occupation section. But I added, because the thresholds between those two different permits for micro business was redundant and confusing. So I eliminated things that were already covered in specific types and they were kind of redundant in nature, but many of the substantial requirements were kept. And like I said before, storefront was in commercial districts only, was reduced to that you don't need any type of use permit. You would still need a license, but I think that we need to work through that process still. So that's what I did with zoning. And then the other part too is that the cultivation section spells out where you cannot have cultivation, which is not a typical way to describe allowable uses in a zoning. So I converted all that section to match an allowable zoning section, and we didn't change any zones in that situation.
So it didn't change the rules, it just changed how we describe.
And it made it clearer for staff to review, because then there's less like, well, is it allowed in this one? Is it allowed in this one? Because we need to really just say where it's allowed. So you don't have to figure out the intent of the original creator of the ordinance. It's just black and white, no matter what year it is.
Okay. Yes.
I see where you're going with some of that, and some of it makes sense. I think though, by removing and making it, permit to in commercial districts, you're wanting to remove, avoid other agency input. I think that's been a big discussion lately. And I think it's not just for cannabis. We're getting ready to go into a general plan where these zones are going to be there are some areas that for currently allowed use, even store, retail, not cannabis, that they may not be appropriate in the areas that were appropriate in 50 years ago. And they need these other agencies' reviews. And I'll be one to advocate when I go to all the general plan meetings that maybe some use permits need to be put on these on high use could be, because these other agencies, some of our roads need to change. Some of our other things need to change, not just for cannabis, but for other commercial use. And I see this as a way to avoid other agency input that we could probably use to update and better serve our county. And that's what I see in that. Some areas, and it might be like in maybe the right user, and I'm not using the right words here, but I think you understand my intent with this, is there still needs to be some public input on places. There still needs to be some agency input on things. And it doesn't necessarily, unfortunately, it is with cannabis right now, because that's what you're putting before us. I would rather wait till the general plan comes out and we can kind of sort it out a little bit more. And that it isn't so oppressive to cannabis in some areas, and that it's more equal for all businesses. All of our stuff is 50 years old, give or take a year or 5. But you're putting it on us now. So I have to come and say, I think you're trying to avoid agency input, because that's what I see. I think that other businesses that are currently allowed in commercial space should maybe have some of that same oversight, just because things have changed in the last 50 years. And so that other agency input is kind of important. Thank you.
All right.
Okay, so I am interested in knowing why a DUP, like I'm in a situation where I need a DUP if I want to put a building in on a parcel when my house fulfills the requirement, the dwelling requirement, because I have a conjoined parcel. So I think, I know it's not like totally in the same intent of this question, but I don't understand if the dwelling requirement is satisfied for my cultivation license, then why do I need a DUP to put a barn in for processing, for instance? And then another question I have for retail, if retail, which I'm not trying to complain that there's retail in a public strip mall, I think that's great. But kids go to the grocery store and to Subway, and why should other commercial properties that are within 1,000 feet of a church or school have that setback because of children, if, as I believe it should be allowed to be in a strip mall? So I think that the 1,000-foot setback for churches and schools is terribly restrictive and unnecessarily so on other commercial properties that could have cannabis store, like retail. That's my point though. At least I got it out there in public.
DUP.
Yeah, what she's referring to is a temporary occupancy code section where when you have a parcel that does not have a dwelling, and you want to build an accessory building before that dwelling or not concurrently, then you need to get a director's use permit as code stands right now in order to build the accessory building in excess of 750 square feet, I think. Then you need to, yeah, or you have to build your dwelling at the same time. I believe from previous conversations I've had with previous directors that the intent there was to allow for future buildable space for a dwelling. I'm not really entirely sure what the intent behind that entire code update was. And that would be something that the planning department could look into.
So it's not something in our ordinance.
I would say there is a code section also, and it's in that same, yeah, it's not in our ordinance, but
Okay.
I've worked in planning here
Yeah,
for
right,
5
right.
years. But there is one section where it says there's exceptions for agricultural structures, but the way that it's written is very ambiguous. So there may need some clarity on the county's part to see if that kind of situation could fit in that. And then to call on her point about churches and schools being terribly restrictive, I did suggest that maybe we send a referral for the ordinance itself to all of the school districts to see if the school districts themselves wish to opt in or opt out. I don't know what the dynamic there is, but it is maybe a way to elicit input because in the past we haven't necessarily done that. And then churches potentially could follow the same path. Not all churches are the same. So especially depending on the area. So that could be a mechanism for trying to figure out if maybe accept these churches or.
So if I'm understanding it's right, it's saying churches and schools in this example could choose to have the 1,000-foot setback from them, or they could say, we don't care. Is that what you're saying?
I'm sorry, you both were talking to me at the same
Yes,
time. I
ma'am.
couldn't hear either of you.
I guess I could talk in the mic. I was thinking in here, we actually have a section that states that sensitive receptors can, I think it's in the buffer reduction. And it's in the buffer reduction section where if your sensitive receptor is okay with your business, then you get your buffer reduction. So that should be covered in what we've got here.
I think we could maybe make it more clear, but
Yeah.
yeah, I agree.
Okay. We are at 9 o'clock, so I do want to wrap this up and I know, Matt, you wanted to make a statement. Okay, so we'll do these last two questions and then we'll just wrap up.
Since we're on similar use zoning, I'm confused I'm still confused at the micro business zoning on why I need to be zoned C1 distribution for a micro business. Or if that, maybe I'm confused on the way the language, but it's parcels that are appropriately zoned for the commercial cannabis permit types. So the micro businesses are the key to us small farmers. They would not impact traffic. Or we have a distributor come to my house. If I can self-distribute, there's no more traffic. Micro businesses are truly the key for us to survive as small farms, to create Trinity businesses. Right now, we have to use distributors out of county. The main distributor for Trinity County lives in San Diego and is based out of San Diego and drives up here. And he's awesome, but he's San Diego. Versus being able to do that ourselves. Like I can't go to Cali Love and sell them my product. It has to go through many different hands versus micro business. So really, and I know we don't have time to go over that, but really nailing down those micro business terms to make it reasonable. And then also on the similar use, yeah, please.
Is he correct in how he's interpreting what's here?
Yeah, the real restriction with micro business is the specific activities that you ask for, right? So we would have to take a more analytical look at the activities that you're asking for and maybe come up with creative solutions for micro business activity.
I mean, there just has to be a difference in understanding that a full-blown distribution that needs a C1 versus my micro business distribution. What are the other ones here?
We do understand you. We've had many conversations
Well, I
like
guess
that, and we do
maybe
understand
the
this.
ordinance reflecting that understanding.
And
I
the
guess is what
EIR
I'm
needs to
looking for.
reflect it as well. So we need to make sure we're within those constraints.
And then I can't find the section right offhand, but there was, it seems like the contiguous parcel being treated as one parcel, that language was changed. I liked the way that was written. So if you own the parcel next, it was like, for the purpose of this ordinance, adjoining parcel under the same ownership is considered one parcel for the blah, blah, blah. And that language changed. And I don't know why that changed. And the cases for me personally that I can think of, it benefits me. So I don't know if it benefits other people to have it changed, but I liked that wording.
I can at least give some insight into, I think, one of the reasons that we moved in the direction to change that. It was brought to our attention from building department that essentially a proposed project wanted to utilize two parcels. And the issue was that because it's two parcels, they have to meet the setback requirements for those parcels separately. So even if you have two parcels, you can't have a greenhouse that spans the two parcels because it doesn't comply with setback requirements. So that's one of the reasons that we moved away from that. And the option would be for that person to do essentially, I think it's a lot line adjustment or a merger.
Merger by lot line adjustment.
So is that, if I'm hearing, I'm sorry, let me just get this straight. So what I'm hearing is we were trying to deal with the way that language was worded. I could go build my barn across the parcel line, which can't be allowed by general planning ordinances and code. And so we're trying to fix that, but that then addresses other issues that he was taking advantage of. And now he would have to do this adjustment by lot line something or other. Is that right? Okay. So we
Merger, yeah.
But so maybe we can at least take the input that if that making that change is having unintended consequences, is there some way we can adjust for that? Okay.
Does that have to go to the planning commission to merger?
No. That's a director's decision through the lot line adjustment process.
It only takes like 6 years in Trinity County to get it done. Actually, 20 years. Nine.
I know lot line adjustments are tough.
It's all about planners.
Yeah.
You need more planners. Yes.
Yes.
My mic
definitely.
cut out. You need more
sta-
planners.
We need more staff. Staff is crucial too in getting it done for sure. I'm not trying to knock you guys at all. I appreciate all that you do. I would just, I guess, following up on what Veronica said, and I would just like beg to please don't do to other businesses what has been done to cannabis. Like, I think you would have full scale revolt at that point. Like it's bad enough doing business in California. Don't do it. On the similar use zoning, I have some of the same, I had like a list of questions that Steve has in regards to the micro business stuff. I feel like I had it kind of sorted out previously. I can discuss that separately with you guys.
If you could email those all in
Yeah.
writing, that would
Totally.
definitely
I
help
know we've
both
had the
of you.
conversation, and so
Yeah.
forth, but yeah, just some clarity on it. And then with the similar use zoning, same thing that Steve mentioned with just, I noticed some of the changes in there with, please don't do away with the contiguous or adjacent parcel dwelling requirement being met by adjacent parcel. I mean, I think that was like a very, I'm pretty sure it's not, but I just wanted to like clarify.
To my understanding, it doesn't have bearing on that residence requirement.
Right.
It really has more to do with two parcels being considered one property. And that was one of the other conflicting pieces of definitions where we had parcel, we had property, and they weren't used consistently. So
I understand. I just hope that it wouldn't get lost in there somewhere. I'm sure it's being looked out for. And then, yeah, just to the allowed use by right. Like I asked for that for a couple of years and ad hoc and so forth. I'm pretty sick of rolling the dice every year with licenses being noticed. Like I look across the river at a county next door that gives use by right because it's a land use entitlement to use your property once you've made it through CEQA and so forth. And I just don't understand how we can be asked to invest like hundreds of thousands more into something that every year could just be a roll of the dice. So I personally, from a business standpoint, emotion aside, it would be very tough to bail on Trinity County's cannabis program at this point, home, family, the whole thing. But like, it's a question without some sort of more assurance. And I think use by right would help solve that.
So I'm just connecting the dots. I think that this is where we've talked about the possibility that going forward, where we have this annual, everything's back up for grabs, we were talking about a process by which, even if it took one last review, that once that buffer zone or whatever is approved, then it's approved and it's not revisited every year. Is this something different or is that the same?
I mean, I think what you're referencing is somewhat similar, but from the last meeting that we had here related to the buffer zones and the requirement to do, one more round of neighbor opposition or consent prior to it converting to the administrator buffer reduction, that's separate from what Tyler is pointing out. And so to kind of your concern, Tyler, that is why there is the new non-conforming section included. So it doesn't enable people to reconfigure their parcel, but it does enable them to maintain their existing configuration into the future with less concern that they might lose their license, with the exception of obviously the new updated enforcement section as it relates to, the criteria to deny or the application or revoke a license going forward for non-compliance issues.
If I had to characterize the feedback that we've received, I kind of sense that people were in support of this moving towards not having to annually basically throw everything back up for grabs. But we did have the suggestion that up to this point, there has been that expectation, and that maybe there, as Drew said, this one last time, let's go through that review process. And then it can become something that's more permanent. Is that?
I mean, what Tyler, I believe he can speak for himself after this, but what I think he's saying is suggesting that these are not annual permits anymore, and that there's some level of security and investment for the permittees. Exactly. None. Yeah, no project that's not within like an annual program.
Okay.
That's what I stated last week. What's just gone through a CEQA process and CEQA, why annually?
Okay. So I know that we have only scratched the surface on our list and on these subjects, but we are past 9. So I want to thank everyone. I did want to acknowledge that Matt asked for a little bit of time here. We're at the end to make a statement on behalf of his community. So we'll definitely keep the Zoom rolling for that. But thank you all for being here. I appreciate that. And even though he'll hit me later for it, I do want to thank Supervisor Frazier. I just acknowledge he's sitting back there quietly, but he's doing the heavy lifting when we're doing a lot of this work because he's had so much experience. And he does the heavy lifting because I'm going to be home and asleep by the time he's halfway home. So thank you.
I super appreciate you, Rick, giving me a couple seconds here just to speak. I want to speak to how the opt-out zone has affected our community. If you don't want me to get into that, I won't. So this TAA petition that happened in the North Lake, and I'm not talking about Lewiston, I'm not talking about the other areas, but what we really experience in this community and what's really happening is that that petition is not going against cannabis. What those group of people that wanted that petition, that what they're trying to achieve is they're trying to fight against us. They're fighting against the counterculture, the youth, and the people in our community that are different. They don't like me because I'm a bus kid, because I lived on dead lot, because I'm a deadhead, because we're the backwoods dreadnecks. They don't like us. And whatever, I get it. They don't like hippies. This is like the age-old thing of rednecks against hippies, you know? But the Emerald Triangle has been our home for generations. And I really believe that we deserve the right to live here and farm here legally. You know, we might be crazy people to all of them. You know, we spread the gospel of Jerry Garcia and the Grateful Dead. We spread the gospel of love and compassion. That's what I live my life off of. Monetary gain is on the bottom of my list. I want to help my community. I grow acres of food. I don't make any money off it because I want to share good, healthy food with my community. You know, it really matters to me. And just our situation is different in North Lake because we've never had the right to get licenses. We're still at day 1 right now. We're fighting for our right to legally cultivate a plant that helps people. And we don't want to do it in the tight little neighborhoods. We respect the people that don't want it right next to their house. We live miles up dirt roads and we want to support our community. And I feel like I'm really dragging this on a little way too far, but you know, I came here in like 2005 and there was generations of people, my brothers and sisters, that had taught me how to cultivate this plant and taught me what these amazing, beautiful little communities in Trinity, Humboldt, and Mendocino were. And just ripping our industry and our ability to keep our communities alive. Like our community in Coffee Creek is dying. We're going to lose our school. We're going to, I don't know, I just ask that you please stand with our community too, and you look at that we can find a compromise in the middle. That there's a lot of people there that don't want it in downtown, and we don't want it either, and we respect that. But we hope that you guys can see that we're a community of love, and we want good things for the community. We don't want to bring bad things. I don't want to bring crime. I'm Keith Grove's neighbor, and he's my good friend. And I don't want to speak for him, but I don't think I've ever brought crime to the neighborhood. I think I've made nothing but friends. And I just hope that you can see that our community also wants to participate and pay taxes and be a part of this too. You know, we want to live in Trinity, and we need this to be able to. And thank you for your time.
Thanks, everyone. And thank you, staff.